The Surgeon's Asset. By Annie Raines. Chapter 1. The Familiar Stranger. The keynote had gone flawlessly, which meant Sarah Jacobs was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She sat alone at the St. Regis bar, still wearing the charcoal Armani suit that had cost her 3 months of student loan payments back when she'd been a junior associate, desperate to look like she belonged in rooms she couldn't yet afford. Now she could buy a dozen of them without checking her account balance, but the muscle memory of that financial anxiety never quite left. The scotch in front of her, Macallan 18 neat, was a $40 middle finger to that old version of herself, the one who used to order house wine and pretend she preferred it. The grand ballroom was 2 floors above her, still humming with the polite thunder of networking conversations and the strategic clink of champagne flutes. Sarah had delivered her keynote on safeguarding high-net-worth assets from fraudulent claims to a standing-room-only crowd of wealth managers, estate attorneys, and people who casually used fiduciary duty in sentences about their personal lives. The applause had run 15 seconds longer than the program allotted. Her senior partner, Dennis White, had sent a text consisting solely of 3 flame emojis, which in Dennis speak meant she just guaranteed herself a corner office. And yet here she was, alone at a hotel bar at 9:30 on a Friday night, because the idea of returning to the reception and enduring another hour of strategic small talk made her want to walk into the San Francisco fog and keep walking until she hit the ocean. The bartender, a woman in her 50s with the practiced warmth of someone who'd seen every variation of human behavior a luxury hotel could produce, refilled Sarah's water glass without being asked. Big crowd up there tonight. 2 conferences, Sarah said. Asset protection law and some kind of cardiac surgery summit. The hotel's playing matchmaker. Strange pairing. Not really. Surgeons get sued. Lawyers protect assets. It's practically a business marriage. The bartender smiled with the specific sympathy reserved for people who reduced human connection to transactional logic and moved down the bar to attend to a couple who'd just settled into the corner booth, their body language performing the kind of easy intimacy Sarah had once believed she'd mastered with Bruce. She looked away. The St. Regis Lounge existed in a permanent state of amber-lit twilight, all velvet and brass, and the kind of engineered elegance that made you forget there was a world outside where people wore sweatpants and ate takeout over their sinks. A pianist somewhere out of sight was working through a jazz standard Sarah couldn't name, the notes drifting through the space like expensive perfume. Every surface gleamed. Every conversation was pitched low enough to suggest discretion. It was the kind of place where powerful people came to pretend they were having spontaneous, unguarded moments. And Sarah fit into it so seamlessly now that she sometimes forgot she'd spent the first 28 years of her life on the outside. Her phone buzzed against the polished mahogany bar top. Dennis White. Calhoun wants to retain us. 7 figures. You made a believer out of him. Dennis White. Also, Priya says you stole her thunder, and she's buying you a drink tomorrow to complain about it. Dennis White. This is what winning looks like, Jacobs. Get used to it. Sarah typed back a thumbs-up emoji and set the phone face down, because the truth was that winning felt exactly like sitting alone at a hotel bar, trying to convince herself she preferred solitude to the exhausting performance of being needed. She'd been good at that performance once. With Bruce, she'd been so good at it that she'd nearly disappeared into it entirely, shaving off pieces of herself so gradually she hadn't noticed until there was almost nothing left. The keynote she'd delivered tonight, the one Dennis was sending flame emojis about, was the keynote she'd almost turned down 8 months ago because Bruce had made a comment about how intimidating her success was becoming. And Sarah, in a moment of catastrophic emotional math, had considered making herself smaller to give him room to feel larger. 2 weeks later, he'd left her for Diane, his 26-year-old secretary who laughed at all his jokes and thought a successful Saturday was brunch and a home goods run. The breakup had been 6 months ago. Sarah had not cried once, which she knew was not the flex she kept telling herself it was. "Excuse me." The voice came from directly beside her, low and urgent and male, and Sarah's entire nervous system went to high alert before her conscious mind had fully processed the words. She turned, one hand instinctively sliding her phone closer, and found herself looking at a man who was either in serious trouble or an extremely committed method actor. He was tall, 6'2", maybe 6'3", with the kind of build that suggested he'd been an athlete once and had since redirected all that disciplined energy into something more cerebral. Dark hair, gray at the temples in a way that looked earned rather than premature. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw that could cut glass, and eyes the color of smoke that were currently fixed on her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of her own pulse. He was also, she noted with the awareness of someone whose job involved reading people under pressure, absolutely terrified. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, and his voice had the kind of crisp, controlled precision that came from years of talking people through life or death decisions. "But I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it in the next 60 seconds. Sarah's hand moved fractionally closer to her purse. "I'm not interested." "I'm not hitting on you." He glanced over his shoulder toward the lobby entrance, and Sarah followed his gaze to see a woman in a red cocktail dress scanning the bar with the focused intensity of a predator who'd just caught a scent. "I need you to pretend you're my wife." Sarah's brain performed several rapid calculations. Threat assessment, exit routes, probability this man is having a psychotic break, probability this is an elaborate scam, probability he's telling the truth and is genuinely in trouble. The woman in red was moving toward them now, her expression shifting from searching to triumphant. "Who is she?" Sarah asked, her voice dropping into the flat, effectless register she used in depositions when she needed to strip emotion from a question. "Tessa Astors. She's been stalking me for 3 months. If she causes a scene in this hotel, in front of the people I'm here to do business with, it will destroy a deal I've spent 3 years building." His eyes met hers, and there was something in them that Sarah recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror often enough. The specific exhaustion of someone who'd been performing competence for so long, they'd forgotten what it felt like to ask for help. "Play along. Tell her you're my wife, and I'll retain your firm on a 6-figure retainer tonight. I saw your keynote. I know who you are." Tessa Astors was 15 feet away now, close enough that Sarah could see the manic brightness in her eyes and the way her hands were clenched at her sides, like she was physically restraining herself from reaching out. Sarah Jacobs had built a career on protecting people's assets from hostile actors. She'd spent 2 hours tonight lecturing a ballroom full of high-net-worth individuals on the importance of defensive legal strategies and proactive risk management. The irony of her keynote topic colliding with reality in real time was so sharp it almost made her laugh. Instead, she picked up her scotch, took a deliberate sip, and then reached out and placed her left hand over the man's right hand where it rested on the bar. "Darling," she said, her voice warm and easy and utterly convincing, "I was wondering when you'd come find me." The man's hand went still under hers. She felt the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his fingers, adrenaline or something older, and then his whole body seemed to exhale. "Sorry I'm late," he said, and his voice had shifted into something softer, more intimate, the kind of tone you used with someone who already knew all your tells. He turned his hand over beneath hers and laced their fingers together. His palm was warm and slightly rough, a working man's hand despite the bespoke suit. The session ran long. Tessa Astors arrived at Sarah's shoulder like a weather system, all crackling energy and the faint, expensive scent of Chanel No. 5 applied with a heavy hand. "Myles," she said, and the single word carried enough intensity to make the bartender glance over with the reflexive alertness of someone trained to spot trouble before it metastasized. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Myles. So that was his name. Sarah knew who he was now, or at least she thought so. He had been at the conference with a deck pitch regarding a new medical device. Tessa. Myles's voice was carefully neutral, a tone you'd use with an unstable patient or a bomb you were trying very hard not to detonate. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" Tessa's eyes slid to Sarah, and Sarah felt herself being evaluated with vicious precision, usually reserved for rival attorneys in a deposition. "I don't think we've met." Sarah smiled, and it was the smile she used when she was about to dismantle someone's entire legal argument in 3 sentences. "Sarah Anderson," she said, and watched Myles's eyes flicker with something like surprise or relief. "Myles's wife." Tessa went still. The bar seemed to contract around them, the ambient jazz and distant conversation fading into a high-pitched hum that Sarah recognized as her own nervous system redlining. This was a mistake. This was absolutely a mistake. She just tied herself to a complete stranger based on 60 seconds of context and a half-articulated business proposition, and if this went sideways— "Wife," Tessa repeated, and the word came out flat and sharp like a knife hitting a cutting board. "That's interesting, because Myles told me 3 months ago that he wasn't seeing anyone." 3 months ago, I wasn't his wife," Sarah said smoothly. "We've been together for 2 years, but we kept it private. You know how it is in our line of work. Everyone has an opinion about your personal life." "What line of work is that?" "I'm an asset protection attorney. I specialize in safeguarding high-net-worth individuals from fraudulent claims." Sarah let the words land with surgical precision and watched Tessa's expression shift from hostile curiosity to something darker. "It's funny, actually. I was just giving a keynote on this exact topic upstairs." Myles's hand tightened fractionally around hers. Tessa's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "How convenient. And where did you two meet?" "UCSF," Myles said before Sarah could answer. Sarah was consulting on a malpractice case. I was still in practice then. "Still in practice?" Tessa echoed. "So you're not operating anymore?" "No." Myles's voice went flat. "I'm not." There was a story there. Sarah could feel the weight of it in the way Myles's whole body had gone rigid beside her, but this was not the moment to excavate it. "That must have been devastating for you," Tessa said, and her tone was all false sympathy and barely concealed satisfaction. "You were such a brilliant surgeon. Everyone said so. It must be hard watching other people do the work you used to do." Sarah felt Myles's hand start to pull away from hers, a reflexive retreat, and she tightened her grip. "He's doing work that matters more," Sarah said, and her voice carried the kind of steel-reinforced certainty that made juries sit up and pay attention. "The epicardial microsleeve is going to save more lives than he ever could have in an operating room. That's not a consolation prize. That's a legacy." Myles turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was so unguarded. Surprise and gratitude and something rawer that she didn't have a name for, that Sarah felt her stomach drop. This was not part of the performance. This was something else entirely. Tessa's eyes narrowed. "You've done your research." "I'm his wife," Sarah said. "Of course I've done my research." "Prove it." The challenge hung in the air between them, sharp and unmistakable. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry?" "Prove you're his wife." Tessa crossed her arms, and her whole posture radiated the particular aggression of someone who just decided to stop pretending to be reasonable. "Show me a wedding ring. Show me a photo. Show me anything that proves you're not just some woman he paid to sit next to him and lie." The bartender was definitely watching them now. So were the couple in the corner booth, their easy intimacy replaced by the alert, slightly hungry attention of people who just realized they were witnessing drama. Myles stood up slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous in a way that made Sarah's pulse kick. "Tessa, you need to leave. Now." "Or what?" Tessa's smile was vicious. "You'll call security. Go ahead. I'm a guest at this hotel, same as you. I have every right to be here." "Tessa, I'm not only Myles's wife, but I am an attorney with the unlimited backing of a high-powered and prestigious law firm behind me. We have resources you cannot imagine. What would we find if we were to investigate you? For Myles' protection, you understand. Think about it. Everyone has skeletons they'd rather remain hidden." Tessa's face went white, then red. "You're bluffing." "I'm an asset protection attorney," Sarah said. "I don't bluff. I do my homework and then I bury people in paperwork until they go away. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave this bar. You're going to leave this hotel, and you're going to stop contacting my husband. If you don't, I will make your life a legal nightmare. Do we understand each other?" For a long, terrible moment, Tessa just stared at her, and Sarah could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. How much of this is real? How much is performance? How far can I push before this woman makes good on her threat? Then Tessa smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd just decided the game wasn't over. It was only beginning. "Congratulations on your marriage," she said, and turned and walked out of the bar with her head high and her spine straight, every inch of her body language screaming, "This isn't finished." Sarah waited until Tessa disappeared into the lobby before she let out the breath she'd been holding. Myles sank back onto his bar stool and put his head in his hands. "Unbelievable!" "Is she gone?" Sarah asked the bartender, who'd moved closer with the practiced alertness of someone ready to call security if necessary. The bartender glanced toward the lobby. "She's in the elevator, heading up." "She's staying here," Myles said, his voice muffled by his hands. "Of course she's staying here. She probably booked a room the second she found out I'd be at this conference." Sarah's brain was already moving through the implications, sorting them into categories of immediate threat, medium-term problem, long-term liability. "How long have you been dealing with this?" 3 months of active stalking. Before that, she was just... Myles lifted his head and dragged a hand through his hair, and Sarah noticed for the first time that it was slightly too long, like he'd been too busy to get it cut. "Her sister and I dated briefly, very briefly. It didn't work out. Teresa was fine with it. Tessa was not." "Tessa Astors," Sarah said, committing the name to memory. "How briefly?" 6 weeks, maybe 2 months if you count the texting phase. It was nothing serious. I was clear about that from the beginning." Myles looked at her, and his eyes were the particular shade of gray that looked different depending on the light. Right now, they looked exhausted. "And then Teresa broke it off, and a month later Tessa showed up at my office saying she'd looked into me and decided we'd be perfect together. That was 3 months ago. It's been escalating ever since." Sarah's professional instincts were screaming at her to extract herself from this situation immediately, to hand Myles a business card and tell him to call her office on Monday and let the associates handle the intake. This was not her problem. This was not her client. This was a man she'd met 10 minutes ago, who'd thrown out an outlandish request that in a moment of insanity, she'd acquiesced, that now threw her into a high-stakes performance with zero preparation and a stalker who was absolutely going to come back for round 2. And yet, "The 6-figure retainer," Sarah heard herself say. "You were serious about that." Myles pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and turned it toward her. It was a wire transfer authorization screen, pre-filled with her firm's banking information and an amount that had 6 zeros after the first digit. "I saw your keynote," Myles said. "I know who you are, and I know what you do. I need someone who can protect my intellectual property and my professional reputation from someone who's actively trying to destroy both. If that means I also need a fake wife to make her back off, then that's what I need. Are you in? Or do I need to find someone else?" Sarah looked at the phone screen, looked at Myles, looked at the empty bar stool where Tessa Astors had been standing 60 seconds ago, radiating the kind of barely controlled chaos that Sarah had spent her entire career learning to neutralize. Sarah's mind replayed relevant pieces of her life. Bruce, who'd left her because her success made him feel small, the keynote she'd delivered 2 hours ago about her chosen profession, safeguarding assets and protecting clients from hostile actors. She thought about the corner office Dennis had promised her and the 7-figure retainer from Harrison Calhoun and the entire architecture of the life she'd built on the principle that she could handle anything as long as she stayed 3 steps ahead and never ever let anyone see her bleed. This was a terrible idea. This was possibly the worst professional decision she'd made in her entire career. Sarah picked up her scotch, drained it, and set the glass down with a decisive click. "I'm in," she said, "but we do this my way. which means we sit down right now and draft terms because I don't care how much money you're offering. I'm not playing your wife without a contract." Myles's mouth curved into the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. "You're exactly as terrifying as I hoped you'd be." "You have no idea," Sarah said, and pulled her laptop out of her bag. It was 9:47 on a Friday night at the St. Regis, San Francisco, and Sarah Jacobs had just agreed to fake marry a man whose name she'd learned 5 minutes ago, whose stalker had a documented history of escalation, and whose hand, she'd noticed, during those 60 seconds of contact, had trembled just slightly beneath hers, like he was holding something broken that he was afraid to let anyone see. This was going to be a disaster. Sarah opened a blank document and started typing. Chapter 2. Forced proximity begins. The presidential suite was a study in aggressive luxury. Opulent as it was, it still felt sterile rather than inviting. Sarah stood in the entryway, her overnight bag in one hand and her laptop case in the other, and tried to reconcile the fact that she'd just agreed to spend the next 4 days living with a complete stranger in 2,400 square feet of marble and floor-to-ceiling windows. "The bedrooms are separate," Myles said from behind her, and she heard the faint defensiveness in his voice, like he was worried she'd think he'd orchestrated this arrangement for reasons other than the ones he'd stated. "You'll have complete privacy. The staff knows we're married, but I can arrange for—" "It's fine," Sarah interrupted, because the alternative was to let him spiral through increasingly awkward explanations. "I've stayed in worse places." It was an attempt at humor to diffuse the awkwardness. She never stayed anywhere remotely like this. The law firm put her up in nice hotels when she traveled for cases, but this was a different category. These accommodations came with a dedicated butler and expensive art. Myles moved past her into the living room, and she noticed the way he carried himself. Controlled, economical, like someone who'd trained his body to take up exactly as much space as necessary. He set his briefcase down on the glass coffee table with a precision unique to him. It showed measured care. "Coffee?" he asked, gesturing toward the wet bar where an elaborate espresso machine gleamed like a piece of surgical equipment. "It's 10:30 at night." That wasn't a no. Sarah found herself smiling despite the surreal absurdity of the situation. "Fine. Yes, coffee." She watched him move through the suite with the ease of someone who'd stayed here before, multiple times based on the way he didn't need to search for the coffee beans or check which cabinet held the cups. The tremor she'd noticed at the bar was less visible now, or maybe he was just better at hiding it when he wasn't under active threat. The contract they'd drafted in the hotel's business center sat in her laptop case, a 4-page document that spelled out the terms of their arrangement with a clinical precision that made it feel almost sane. Duration, 4 days, concluding with the end of the conference. Scope of performance, public appearances only, no private intimacy required. Compensation, the 6-figure retainer already wired to her firm's account. And termination clauses. Either party could end the arrangement immediately if the other violated the terms or if the threat level escalated beyond manageable parameters. It was airtight, professional, the kind of contract Sarah could defend in front of the state bar if this somehow went sideways. It was also, she was increasingly aware, completely inadequate preparation for the reality of what they'd just agreed to do. "How do you take it?" Myles asked, and it took Sarah a moment to realize he was talking about the coffee. "Black. 2 sugars." He handed her a cup a moment later, and their fingers brushed during the transfer. The contact was brief and unremarkable, and sent a small, unwelcome jolt of awareness up her arm that she immediately categorized as adrenaline and stress, definitely not attraction. "So," Myles said, settling into one of the leather armchairs that faced the windows. The San Francisco skyline glittered beyond the glass like a circuit board, all light and geometry and the illusion of order. "We should probably get our story straight." Sarah sat across from him, the coffee cup warm against her palms. "We met 2 years ago when I was consulting on a malpractice case at UCSF. You were still operating then. We kept the relationship private because of professional boundaries." And we got married when? 6 months ago. City Hall, no big ceremony. We're both too busy for that kind of thing. Sarah pulled out her phone and opened a note. We need to establish basic biographical details. Where did you grow up? Portland, you? Sacramento? Siblings? One brother, older. He's a software engineer in Seattle. You? Only child, Sarah typed rapidly. Parents? Father's a retired high school principal. Mother taught English literature. Both still in Portland, still married, aggressively wholesome. They'll be thrilled when they find out about this. Sarah's fingers paused on the screen. You're going to tell them? God, no. I meant theoretically. Myles took a sip of his coffee, and something in his expression shifted. Less guarded, more amused. My mother has been asking about my personal life with increasing desperation for the past 5 years. If she knew I'd gotten married without inviting her, she'd drive down here and stage an intervention. So we're lying to everyone. We're maintaining operational security, Myles corrected, and the clinical phrasing was so absurd that Sarah actually laughed. Is that what we're calling it? Would you prefer committing fraud? I'd prefer protecting a client's assets from a credible threat, which is actually what my job description says I do. Sarah set her phone down. Speaking of which, I need you to tell me everything about Tessa Astors, and I mean everything. When did you first meet her? What exactly has she done over the past 3 months? Has she made explicit threats? Myles's expression went carefully neutral, and Sarah recognized the look. It was the same one she used when a deposition question got too close to something she didn't want to examine. I met Tessa once while I was dating Teresa, he said. Dinner at Teresa's apartment. Tessa showed up uninvited, stayed for maybe 20 minutes. She was intense, asked a lot of questions about my work. Teresa apologized for her later, said her sister had boundary issues. And after you and Teresa broke up? Nothing for about a month. Then Tessa started showing up, first at a conference in Seattle. She claimed it was a coincidence, then at my office building in Palo Alto, then at a restaurant where I was having dinner with colleagues, always with some explanation for why she happened to be there, always trying to start a conversation. Did you engage? The first few times, yes. I was polite. I tried to be clear I wasn't interested without being cruel about it. Myles's hand tightened around his coffee cup. That was a mistake. She interpreted politeness as encouragement. Sarah had heard this story before, in a dozen different variations. The client who thought they could manage the situation through clear communication and reasonable boundaries, only to discover that the person on the other side wasn't operating from the same playbook. When did it escalate? 6 weeks ago. She started sending emails, long ones, talking about how we were meant to be together and how she'd researched my work and understood me in ways no one else could. Then she found out about the summit. I don't know how the attendance list isn't public, and sent an email saying she'd be here and we should finally have a real conversation. Did you respond? I had my attorney send a cease and desist letter. She ignored it. Sarah pulled her laptop out and opened it on her knee. I need you to forward me every email, every text message, every documented interaction you've had with her. Tonight, before we go to sleep. Already done. I sent them to the firm email on your business card while you were in the bathroom at the business center. Sarah blinked. That was 15 minutes ago. I'm efficient. You're paranoid. I prefer appropriately vigilant. Myles set his coffee cup down and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Look, I know this is insane. I know I'm asking you to put yourself in the middle of a situation that could blow up in both our faces. But I've spent 3 years building the EMS from the ground up, and I'm 48 hours away from closing the licensing deal that will get it into clinical trials at scale. If Tessa causes a scene at tomorrow night's gala, or corners one of the investors and starts talking about how I'm avoiding her, or does anything that makes me look unstable or ethically compromised, that deal evaporates. And if that deal evaporates, the device dies. And if the device dies... He stopped, and Sarah saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. If the device dies? She prompted quietly. Then I've spent 3 years building a monument to a career I can't have anymore, and I have nothing to show for it except a hand that doesn't work and a stalker I can't shake. Myles looked at her, and his eyes were the color of smoke and exhaustion. So yes, I'm paranoid, because I've already lost everything once, and I can't afford to lose it again. The silence that followed was heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Sarah understood loss, not the same kind, but the same shape, the way it carved you out and left you walking around with a U-sized hole where your life used to be. The tremor, she said, because if they were going to do this, she needed to know everything. When did it start? Myles's expression shuddered immediately. That's not relevant. It's absolutely relevant. If Tessa knows about it, she can weaponize it. If she doesn't, we need to make sure she doesn't find out. Either way, I need to know. For a moment, she thought he was going to refuse. Then he held up his right hand, palm down, fingers spread. The tremor was barely visible, a faint rhythmic oscillation that you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Car accident 3 years ago, nerve damage to my dominant hand. His voice was flat, clinical, like he was discussing someone else's pathology. It's permanent. It's also disqualifying for surgical practice at the level I was operating, so I stopped operating. And started inventing. He agreed. The EMS is what a surgeon builds when he can't hold a scalpel anymore but still needs to fix broken hearts. Sarah's throat tightened unexpectedly. She forced herself to take a sip of coffee, to give herself a moment to lock down the surge of empathy that was threatening to compromise her professional distance. Tessa doesn't know about the accident, Myles continued. She knows I'm not operating anymore, but she thinks it was a choice, a strategic pivot. That's the story I tell everyone. Why? Because if people know I was forced out, they start asking questions about whether the EMS is legitimate innovation or just, he gestured vaguely, compensation, a consolation prize, something I'm building because I can't do the real work anymore. That's not what it is. No, but that's what it looks like. Myles stood abruptly and moved to the windows, his back to her. The device works, it's going to save lives, but if the licensing partners think I'm emotionally compromised, or that I'm building it out of some kind of wounded pride instead of genuine scientific merit, they'll walk, and I can't let that happen. Sarah set her laptop aside and stood, moving to join him at the window. The city stretched out below them, indifferent and glittering. We're going to make this work, she said, and her voice carried the same steel-reinforced certainty she'd used on Tessa in the bar. 4 days. We show up together at every public event. We perform the hell out of this marriage, and we make sure everyone in this hotel believes we're exactly what we say we are, Tessa included. Myles turned to look at her, and something in his expression shifted, less guarded, more curious. You're very good at this. At what? Projecting absolute confidence when the situation is completely unhinged. Sarah smiled thinly. It's my entire job description. Is it also your personality, or is that just the professional armor? The question landed harder than it should have, because it was the same question Sarah had been asking herself for 6 months, ever since Bruce had left, and she'd realized she'd spent 2 years performing a version of herself that had almost nothing to do with who she actually was. I don't know anymore, she admitted, and the honesty surprised her. I used to think I did. Now I'm not sure there's a difference. Myles studied her for a long moment, and Sarah had the unsettling sense that he was seeing past the Armani suit and the practiced composure to something rawer underneath. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I think the version of you that just threatened to bury a stalker in legal paperwork while drinking a $40 scotch is pretty close to the real thing. Sarah's breath caught. You don't know me. No, but I know what it looks like when someone spent years building armor they can't take off. I see it in the mirror every morning. The air between them felt suddenly charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Sarah's pulse kicked, and she told herself it was adrenaline, stress, the surreal pressure of the situation they'd just locked themselves into. It was definitely not attraction. "We should go to bed," she said abruptly. "Separately, in our separate bedrooms. We have the investor breakfast at 8 tomorrow morning, and we need to be convincingly married," Myles finished. "I know." He moved past her toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms, and Sarah caught the faint scent of his cologne, something clean and understated that probably cost more than it should. "Sarah?" She turned. He was standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said, "for saying yes. I know this is insane. I was going to say above and beyond, but sure. Insane works." Sarah found herself smiling despite everything. "Get some sleep, Myles. We have a marriage to sell tomorrow." He nodded and disappeared down the hallway, and a moment later she heard the quiet click of a door closing. Sarah stood alone in the living room, surrounded by 2,400 square feet of luxury and the weight of a decision she still wasn't entirely sure she understood. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. "Dennis White, retainer cleared. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Dennis White. Also, you're officially on the Calhoun account. Partnership track just got shorter." Sarah stared at the messages, then looked around the suite, at the wet bar and the art and the windows that framed the city like a promise she wasn't sure she wanted to keep. 4 days. She could do anything for 4 days, even pretend to be married to a man whose hand trembled when he thought no one was looking, whose life's work hung in the balance, and who'd looked at her in the bar like she was the only solid thing in a world that had gone dangerously unstable. Sarah picked up her laptop case and headed toward her assigned bedroom, already mentally cataloging everything she'd need to research before tomorrow. Tessa Astors' full background, the investor list for the EMS licensing deal, the conference schedule, and the exact legal parameters of what she'd just agreed to do. The door to Myles's bedroom was closed, but she could see the light underneath it, a thin golden line that suggested he was still awake, probably doing exactly what she was about to do, preparing for a performance neither of them could afford to get wrong. Sarah closed her own door, set her laptop on the desk, and opened her firm's encrypted database. She typed, "Tessa Astors." And then, because she couldn't help herself, Dr. Myles Anderson. The search results loaded, and Sarah began to read. By the time she finally climbed into bed 2 hours later, she knew 3 things with absolute certainty. 1. Tessa Astors had a documented history of escalating obsession that included a prior restraining order from a tech executive in San Jose. 2. Myles Anderson had been one of the most celebrated cardiothoracic surgeons on the West Coast before his career-ending accident, and the professional devastation of that loss was written all over his public record in the form of abruptly canceled surgeries and quietly withdrawn conference presentations. 3. Sarah Jacobs had just agreed to fake marry a man who was exactly as broken as she was, and exactly as good at hiding it. This was going to be a disaster. But as she lay in the dark listening to the faint sounds of the city below and the even fainter sound of movement from the room down the hall, Sarah realized she was no longer sure whether the disaster she was afraid of was the one where everything fell apart, or the one where it didn't. Chapter 3. The Wall Goes. The investor breakfast was held in a private dining room on the St. Regis's 3rd floor, all dark wood paneling and diffused morning light that made everyone look like they'd just stepped out of a pharmaceutical commercial. Sarah arrived at 7:55 wearing a navy sheath dress and the diamond studs her grandmother had left her, which were the only jewelry she owned that could pass for wedding appropriate without actually being wedding rings. The ring situation was a problem they'd identified at 6:30 that morning, when Myles had knocked on her bedroom door with 2 cups of coffee and the tense, over-caffeinated energy of someone who'd slept approximately 90 minutes. "We need rings," he'd said, handing her a cup. Sarah had been awake since 5, cross-referencing Tessa Astors' litigation history with the St. Regis's security protocols. "I know. I can have something couriered from Tiffany's within the hour." "Don't." Sarah had taken a sip of coffee, black, 2 sugars, exactly how she'd told him last night, and tried not to read too much into the fact that he'd remembered. "Tessa will check the purchase date. We need rings that look like they've been worn for 6 months." Myles had stared at her. "You're terrifyingly thorough." That's why you're paying me." They'd solved it by raiding the hotel's lost and found, a transaction that had required Sarah to deploy her most authoritative attorney voice and Myles to slip the concierge $200 in cash. The resulting rings, a simple platinum band for him, a vintage setting with a small diamond for her, looked appropriately worn and sat on her finger now with the weight of a lie she was actively choosing to tell. Myles was already in the dining room when she arrived, standing near the windows in conversation with a silver-haired man Sarah recognized from her research as Dr. Emmett Flynn, chief of cardiac surgery at Stanford and the most influential skeptic of the EMS device. Myles's posture was relaxed, his smile easy, and if Sarah hadn't spent 2 hours last night reading about the professional devastation he'd survived, she never would have guessed he was performing. He saw her, and his entire face transformed, not dramatically, but enough. The smile shifted from professional to intimate. His eyes tracked her movement across the room with the focused attention of someone who'd been waiting specifically for her. It was a good performance. It was an extremely good performance, and Sarah's pulse kicked in a way that had nothing to do with the role she was playing. "There she is," Myles said, and the warmth in his voice sounded so genuine that for a disorienting moment, Sarah forgot they'd only met 12 hours ago. He reached for her hand as she approached, lacing their fingers together with the same easy familiarity he'd deployed at the bar. "Dr. Flynn, I'd like you to meet my wife, Sarah." Dr. Flynn's handshake was firm and assessing. "Mrs. Anderson, Myles didn't mention he was married." "I prefer to keep my personal life separate from my professional one," Myles said smoothly. "Sarah's an attorney. She understands the value of discretion." "Asset protection law," Sarah added, because the best lies were built on frameworks of truth. "I specialize in safeguarding intellectual property from hostile acquisition attempts." Dr. Flynn's eyebrows rose fractionally. How convenient, given Myles's current position. There was something in his tone, not quite accusation, but close enough that Sarah felt her spine straighten reflexively. "Convenient would be if we'd met after his device started generating industry interest," Sarah said, her voice carrying just enough edge to make it clear she'd caught the implication. "We met 2 years ago. The EMS was barely past the concept phase. So no, Dr. Flynn, my presence in his life isn't strategic positioning, it's just marriage." Myles's hand tightened around hers, surprise or warning or something else she couldn't tell. Dr. Flynn studied her for a long moment, then smiled. "I apologize. That was inappropriate. It's just rare to see Myles with anyone. He's been something of a monk since he left surgical practice." "Well," Myles said, and his voice had gone very carefully neutral, "I had other priorities." The statement landed in the space between them like a stone dropping into still water. Sarah felt the ripple of it, the thing Myles wasn't saying, the wound he was working very hard to keep covered. "The EMS is extraordinary work," Dr. Flynn said, and his tone had shifted into something more genuine. "If it performs in Phase 3 trials the way it did in Phase 2, you'll have revolutionized post-surgical cardiac care. That's not hyperbole, that's just fact." "Thank you," Myles said quietly, "but you understand my concern." Dr. Flynn glanced around the room. The other investors were starting to filter in, collecting coffee and pastries from the elaborate buffet. "Stanford's putting significant capital behind this licensing partnership. We need to know the device is sound, and we need to know the man behind it is sound. No offense, but you walked away from one of the most prestigious surgical programs on the West Coast with very little explanation. That raises questions." Sarah felt Myles go rigid beside her, and her professional instincts kicked in before her conscious mind caught up. "Dr. Flynn," she said, her voice dropping into the flat, affectless register she used when she needed to end a conversation immediately. "With respect, my husband's medical history is protected information. If you're suggesting Stanford's investment is contingent on disclosure beyond what's legally required, I'd recommend you speak with your institution's counsel before this conversation continues." The temperature in the immediate vicinity dropped approximately 10 degrees. Dr. Flynn blinked. I wasn't suggesting— Yes, you were. Sarah smiled, the smile that made opposing counsel nervous. And I understand why. Due diligence is important, but there's a line between appropriate vetting and inappropriate inquiry into protected health information, and you just crossed it. So let's reset. The EMS device works. The clinical trial data is independently verified. Myles's personal medical history is irrelevant to the science. Are we clear? Dr. Flynn looked at Myles. Your wife is formidable. Yes, Myles said, and there was something raw in his voice that made Sarah's chest tighten. She is. Dr. Flynn excused himself to join a cluster of other investors near the buffet, and Sarah felt Myles's hand slide out of hers. When she turned to look at him, his expression was unreadable. That was— he started. Necessary, Sarah interrupted. He was fishing. If you'd answered, he would have used it against you. I know, Myles stopped, his jaw tightening. I didn't ask you to fight that battle for me. You hired me to protect your assets. That includes your privacy. Sarah kept her voice low, aware of the other attendees circulating nearby. Unless you'd prefer I let people interrogate you about your medical history at a breakfast meeting? No, I'd prefer— He stopped again, and Sarah saw the muscle in his jaw working. Never mind, thank you, for the intervention. He moved away before she could respond, crossing the room to join Dr. James Turcotte, the former residency colleague who'd been advocating for the EMS device since its inception. Sarah watched him go, tracking the careful control in his posture, the way he'd locked down whatever he'd been about to say. She'd seen that move before. Bruce had done it constantly. The conversational retreat, the refusal to finish difficult sentences, the implication that Sarah's competence was somehow an indictment of his adequacy. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. Dennis White. How's the fake marriage going? Sarah stared at the message. She hadn't told Dennis the marriage was fake. She'd told him she'd retained a significant client and planned working the conference remotely for the weekend. Dennis White. Relax. I'm a lawyer. I can read a rushed retainer agreement. Also, you're wearing a different ring than usual. I have your back on this. Dennis White. Make it convincing. Calhoun's watching. Sarah's head snapped up. Harrison Calhoun, the high-net-worth investor who'd requested her firm's services after her keynote, was indeed in the room, standing near the windows in conversation with a woman Sarah recognized as Dr. Elizabeth Massey, one of the EMS device's potential licensing partners. And he was looking directly at her. Sarah smiled and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, then crossed the room toward the buffet, hyper-aware of being observed. She collected a plate of fruit and a croissant she had no intention of eating, then positioned herself near enough to Myles's conversation that it would look natural for him to pull her in. He did, almost immediately, his hand finding the small of her back with a familiarity that sent an unwelcome shiver up her spine. Dr. Turcotte, this is my wife, Sarah, Myles said, and the performance was back in place, the warmth, the ease, the suggestion of intimacy that looked effortless and probably cost him everything. Dr. Turcotte was younger than most of the other investors, maybe early 40s, with the kind of restless energy that suggested he'd been the youngest attending in his program and hadn't quite adjusted to having peers. The attorney, he said, shaking her hand. Myles mentioned you were brilliant. He undersold it based on what I just watched you do to Emmett Flynn. I wasn't trying to eviscerate him, Sarah said mildly, just establish boundaries. Same thing, in my experience. Turcotte grinned. How long have you two been together? 2 years, Myles said. At the exact same moment, Sarah said, 6 months. The silence that followed was crystalline and terrible. Turcotte's eyebrows rose. Which is it? 2 years together, Sarah corrected smoothly, her brain already calculating damage control. 6 months married. I was answering the wrong question. Right. Turcotte looked between them, and Sarah could see him filing the discrepancy away for future examination. Well, congratulations. Marriage is— He paused, searching for a word. A significant commitment. Yes, Myles said, and his hand pressed slightly harder against Sarah's back, warning or apology she couldn't tell. It is. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, covering the EMS device's clinical trial timeline and the proposed licensing structure, but Sarah barely tracked it. Her entire nervous system was focused on the mistake they'd just made, the crack in the performance that Turcotte had absolutely noticed. When the breakfast finally ended and the investors began filtering out toward their respective conference sessions, Myles walked her into the hallway with his hand still at her back, the picture of a devoted husband escorting his wife. The second they were alone in the elevator, his hand dropped. 2 years, he said flatly. We agreed on 2 years. I know, I got confused. Sarah pressed the button for their floor with more force than necessary. It won't happen again. It can't happen again. Turcotte's going to mention that discrepancy to someone, and then we're going to have to explain it, and every explanation we give is another opportunity to get caught in a lie. I'm aware of how lying works, Myles. It's half my job. Then maybe you should be better at it. The words landed like a slap. Sarah turned to face him, and whatever expression was on her face made Myles take a step back. I'm sorry, he said immediately. I didn't mean... Yes, you did. Sarah's voice was very calm, very controlled, and absolutely furious. You meant exactly that, because I just spent the last hour watching you perform the role of grateful husband while simultaneously resenting the fact that I had to defend you, and now you're taking that resentment out on me because I made one mistake. That's not... Don't. Sarah held up a hand. I've done this dance before, with my ex-fiancé. Every time I was good at something, every time I succeeded where he struggled, it became my fault. My competence was an indictment of his adequacy, and I spent 2 years making myself smaller to give him room to feel bigger, and it still wasn't enough. The elevator doors opened onto their floor. Sarah stepped out without waiting to see if Myles followed. Sarah. She kept walking, her heels clicking against the marble with a rhythm that sounded like retreat or fury or both. Sarah, stop! She stopped, turned. Myles was standing 5 feet away, his expression stricken. I'm sorry, he said quietly. You're right. That was unfair. You've done nothing but help me since the moment I sat down next to you last night, and I just... He stopped, his hand flexing at his side. I'm not used to needing help, and I'm really not used to someone being better at protecting me than I am at protecting myself. Sarah's anger didn't dissipate. Anger never did, not cleanly, but it shifted into something more complicated. I'm not trying to diminish you, she said. I know, but it feels like that anyway. Myles moved closer, and his voice dropped. I spent 3 years building a device that does what my hands can't do anymore. The whole point was to prove I'm still useful, still relevant, still capable of contributing something meaningful. And then you show up and handle in 30 seconds what I've been failing to handle for 3 months, and it makes me feel obsolete, Sarah finished, because she understood that feeling intimately. Yes. They stood in the hallway, 2 people who'd known each other less than 24 hours, and the silence between them was full of things neither of them wanted to name. This isn't going to work if we can't trust each other, Sarah said finally. I know. And it's definitely not going to work if you punish me every time I'm good at my job. I know that too. Myles met her eyes. It won't happen again. You said that about Tessa. Tessa's different. Tessa's... He stopped, and something in his expression shifted into something darker. Tessa's escalating. I got an email from her this morning. She knows we're sharing a suite. Sarah's blood went cold. How? I don't know, but she does, and she's threatening to expose the truth at tonight's gala. Show me the email. Myles pulled out his phone and handed it to her. Sarah read the message once, then again, her professional instincts cataloging every threat, every implication, every legal vulnerability. We need to loop in hotel security, she said. No, if we involve security, it becomes official. It gets documented. And if it gets documented, the investors will hear about it and then they'll know you have a stalker, which is not actually a character flaw, Myles. It's a crime being committed against you. It's a liability to the licensing deal, to the device, to everything I've built. His voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "I can't let her destroy this. I can't lose everything again." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the same thing she'd seen last night in the bar. A man operating at the absolute edge of his capacity, holding together by force of will alone. She made a decision. "Okay," she said, "no security. But we do this my way, which means I'm going to dig into Tessa's background until I find something we can use as leverage, and you're going to trust me to handle it. Can you do that?" Myles was quiet for a long moment, then, "Yes." "Good, because tonight's gala is going to be a performance, and we can't afford another mistake, which means we need to practice." "Practice what?" Sarah stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to maintain eye contact. "Being married, convincingly. Because right now we look like two people who just met and are trying very hard to pretend otherwise, and Tessa's going to exploit that the second she sees an opening." "What do you suggest?" "Proximity, familiarity, the kind of physical ease that comes from actually knowing someone." Sarah reached up and straightened his tie, a gesture that was intimate and casual and made Myles go very still. Married people touch each other without thinking about it. They anticipate each other's movements. They have inside jokes and shared references and 1,000 small interactions that signal history. "We don't have history." "No, but we have 18 hours before the gala, so we're going to build one." Myles's eyes searched hers. "You're serious?" "Completely. We're going to spend the day together, not at the conference, at the places couples actually go. Lunch, a walk, maybe the museum. We're going to have conversations that aren't about the EMS or Tessa or the fact that this entire situation is insane. And by tonight, we're going to be able to stand next to each other without looking like we're faking it. Because we'll actually know each other." "Exactly." Sarah watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, the risk assessment, the cost-benefit analysis, the same clinical precision he probably brought to every surgical decision he'd ever made. "Okay," he said finally, "but I'm buying lunch." "Myles, you're already paying me 6 figures. Consider it a performance bonus." He smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since the elevator. "Besides, if we're building a fake marriage, we might as well enjoy it." Sarah found herself smiling back despite everything. "Fine, but I'm picking the restaurant." "Deal." They stood in the hallway for another moment, close enough that Sarah could see the faint shadows under his eyes and the tension he was carrying in his shoulders. Close enough that when he reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture that was probably meant to look husbandly and instead felt startlingly intimate, she had to consciously remind herself to breathe. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not walking away. I know this is a disaster waiting to happen." "I was going to say more complicated than you signed up for." "It's definitely that, too." Sarah stepped back, putting necessary distance between them. "But I don't walk away from clients, even the ones who are terrible at accepting help." "I'm working on that." "Work faster. We have a gala to survive tonight." Myles nodded and headed down the hall toward his bedroom. Sarah watched him go, then pulled out her phone and opened her encrypted connection to the firm's investigative database. She typed Tessa Astors, restraining orders, civil litigation history, psychiatric records if accessible. Then, because she couldn't help herself, Dr. Myles Anderson, accident reports, medical board filings, insurance claims. The results began loading, and Sarah settled into the living room with her laptop, preparing to do what she did best, find the leverage, identify the vulnerabilities, and build a defense that would hold. But as she read through Tessa's litigation history, the prior stalking victim, the pattern of escalation, the disturbing parallels to their current situation, Sarah realized the wall she'd just built between herself and Myles wasn't protection. It was fear. Because the most dangerous thing about this arrangement wasn't Tessa, or the investors, or the possibility of getting caught in a lie. It was the fact that when Myles had touched her face in the hallway, Sarah's first instinct hadn't been to pull away. It had been to lean in. And that was a problem she had absolutely no idea how to solve. Chapter 4. Cracks in the Armor. The restaurant Sarah chose was a small Italian place in North Beach, a neighborhood trattoria that didn't take reservations and was far too busy to care if you were famous. Myles had suggested somewhere closer to the hotel, efficient, controlled, easily contained within their conference bubble, but Sarah had vetoed it immediately. "If we're going to build a believable history," she'd said, standing in the presidential suite's living room with her laptop still open to Tessa's disturbing litigation record, "we need to go somewhere that feels real, not performative." So now they sat wedged into a small table with checkered tablecloth and wine bottles serving as candle holders, surrounded by actual couples having actual conversations. And Myles looked more uncomfortable than he had facing down Dr. Flynn's interrogation. "This is very," he started, glancing around at the crowded room. "Normal?" Sarah supplied, accepting a menu from their server. "I was going to say loud." "That's what normal sounds like when you're not sequestered in luxury hotels." She studied the menu, hyper-aware of the way Myles's knee was almost touching hers under the small table, the enforced proximity that was supposedly the entire point of this exercise. "When's the last time you went to a restaurant that didn't have a sommelier?" Myles was quiet for a moment. "Before the accident, I used to go to this taco truck near the hospital between surgeries. Does that count?" "It absolutely counts." Sarah set down her menu. "What happened to it?" "Still there as far as I know. I just stopped going." "Why?" "Because everyone there knew me as Dr. Anderson the surgeon, and I didn't want to keep explaining why I wasn't Dr. Anderson the surgeon anymore." He said it matter-of-factly, but Sarah heard the weight beneath the words, the accumulated grief of 1,000 small losses that added up to a completely different life. Their server returned, and Sarah ordered the carbonara while Myles requested something in Italian that made the server's face light up with approval. When she left, Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You speak Italian?" "My grandmother was from Sicily. She refused to speak English at Sunday dinners." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I learned Italian out of self-defense. If you wanted seconds, you had to ask for them properly." It was the first genuinely personal thing he'd told her that wasn't extracted under duress or professional necessity. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a hairline crack in the careful distance she'd been maintaining. "Tell me about her," she said. "Why?" "Because if we're married, I would know about your Sicilian grandmother, and you would know." She stopped, searching for something equally personal she was willing to offer. "You would know that I can't cook to save my life, and that my mother tried to teach me exactly once before declaring me a lost cause and buying me a collection of takeout menus as a housewarming gift." Myles's expression softened into something that looked almost like fondness. "Your mother sounds practical." "She's a public defender. Practicality is her religion." Sarah accepted the wine the server poured, a red that tasted like cherries and something darker. "Your turn. Grandmother." Nonna Maria, 4'10", terrifying, made the best osso buco on the West Coast. She died when I was in residency. Myles's fingers traced the edge of his wine glass, a restless movement that drew Sarah's attention to his hands, the right one, with its barely visible tremor, the left one steady and strong. "I was supposed to be at her funeral. I got pulled into an emergency surgery instead. 15-year-old kid with a congenital heart defect. I chose the surgery." "Did you save him?" "Yes." "Then your grandmother would have understood." Myles looked up sharply. "You didn't know her." "No, but I know what it means to be good at something that costs you everything else." Sarah took a sip of wine. "My engagement ended because I was better at my job than I was at being the person Bruce needed me to be. Or maybe I was exactly as good at both, and he just couldn't handle the ratio." "He's an idiot." The words came out flat and certain, and Sarah felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. "He's also currently calling my office twice a day trying to get me to back a loan for his failing construction business." "Really? How long ago did you break up?" 6 months. He left me for his secretary. The business started tanking. The secretary left him, and now he's decided I'm his best option for financial salvation." Sarah heard the bitterness in her own voice and tried to dial it back. "My assistant has instructions to route his calls directly to voicemail." "But he knows you're here." It wasn't a question. Sarah met Myles's eyes and saw the same rapid calculation she'd watched him perform a dozen times already. Threat assessment, risk analysis, defensive positioning. "He knows I'm at a conference in San Francisco," she said carefully. "I don't know if he knows which hotel. If Tessa could find out, he can find out." Probably. The food arrived before Myles could respond, her carbonara perfect and steaming, his dish something with braised short ribs that smelled extraordinary. They ate in silence for a few minutes, and Sarah was surprised to realize it was a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled with performance or deflection. "Can I ask you something?" Myles said finally. "That's a dangerous opening." "Why did you say yes? Last night at the bar. You could have walked away. You should have walked away. Instead, you agreed to fake marry a stranger to help him deal with his stalker. That's not normal attorney behavior." Sarah set down her fork and considered the question. The actual answer, that she'd recognized something in his desperation that mirrored her own, that she'd spent 6 months building walls, and his crisis had offered her a reason to do something other than hide behind them, felt too raw to say aloud. "The retainer was compelling," she said instead. "Nonsense." She blinked. "Excuse me? You don't need the money. Your firm's already successful, you're on partnership track, and you were about to land a 7-figure client regardless of whether you helped me. So try again. Why did you say yes?" Sarah took a long sip of wine, buying time. Myles waited, his attention fixed on her with the same focused intensity she'd seen him bring to conversations about the EMS device, like whatever she said next actually mattered. "Because Tessa reminded me of every hostile actor I've spent my career defending against," Sarah said finally. "The people who think they're entitled to something that isn't theirs, who escalate when you set boundaries, who weaponize your own competence against you, and I'm very good at making those people go away." "That's still not the entire answer." "No." Sarah met his eyes. "The whole answer is that you looked at me like I was the only person in that bar who could help you, and I haven't felt useful to anyone in a very long time. So yes, the retainer was compelling, but mostly I said yes because you needed me to, and I wanted to be needed for something other than my ability to draft airtight contracts." The confession landed between them like something breakable. Myles's expression shifted through several emotions Sarah couldn't quite name, before settling into something that looked almost like understanding. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For what?" "For making you feel like your competence is a problem. This morning, after the breakfast, that wasn't about you. That was about me and my inability to accept that I can't control everything anymore." Apology accepted. "But Myles," Sarah leaned forward slightly, "if we're going to make this work, the performance, the next 4 days, all of it, you need to stop treating my help like it's a referendum on your adequacy. I'm not trying to replace you. I'm trying to protect you. There's a difference." "I know. Intellectually, I know that. But 3 years ago, I could hold a human heart in my hands and repair it, and now I can't hold a coffee cup without it shaking. So, when you handle in 30 seconds what I've been failing to handle for 3 months, it's hard not to feel like I'm being saved? Erased." The word hung in the air between them, raw and honest and more vulnerable than anything else Myles had said. Sarah felt her throat tighten. "You're not being erased," she said. "You're being protected, and there's no shame in that, even though I know it feels like there is." Myles's hand moved across the table, not quite reaching for hers, but close enough that Sarah could have closed the distance if she'd wanted to. She kept her hands wrapped around her wineglass instead, maintaining the boundary even as every instinct told her to let it dissolve. "Tell me about the EMS," she said, deliberately shifting the conversation to safer ground, not the technical specs, the why. Why this device? Why this specific approach? Myles sat back slightly, and Sarah watched him recalibrate, surgeon to inventor, personal to professional. Because post-surgical arrhythmia is one of the leading causes of cardiac patient mortality, and the current pharmaceutical interventions have brutal side effects, he said. Patients survive the surgery but spend the rest of their lives managing the drugs that keep their hearts beating regularly. The EMS changes that. It's a bridge technology. It supports the heart externally while it heals, delivers targeted medication directly to the cardiac tissue, and then biodegrades once the heart is strong enough to function independently. You're coaching broken hearts back to independence. Yes? That's not just medicine, that's philosophy. Myles smiled, and it was genuine and slightly self-deprecating. My therapist said the same thing, right before she suggested I might be projecting. Are you? Probably. He took a sip of wine. But it doesn't make the device less valid. It works. The Phase 2 trials were extraordinary. If we can get through Phase 3 and secure FDA approval, we'll change cardiac care permanently. And if Tessa destroys the licensing deal before that happens, then 3 years of work disappears, and I'll have nothing to show for the fact that I can't practice medicine anymore except a device that never made it out of clinical trials. His voice was flat, clinical, but Sarah heard the devastation underneath it. So no, I can't let that happen. I can't lose this. Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand over his before she could second-guess the impulse. His hand went still under hers. The same faint tremor she'd felt last night at the bar, the physical manifestation of everything he'd lost. You won't, she said, because I'm not going to let her destroy this. That's what you hired me for. Myles turned his hand over, lacing their fingers together, and the gesture felt less like performance and more like something neither of them knew how to name. Thank you, he said quietly. They sat like that for a long moment, hands linked across a checkered tablecloth in a crowded North Beach trattoria, while conversations flowed around them and the wine bottles flickered, and Sarah tried very hard not to think about the fact that this felt more real than any moment she'd shared with Bruce in 2 years of actual engagement. Her phone buzzed in her purse. She reluctantly pulled her hand away and checked the screen. Dennis White. Bruce just showed up at the office asking for you. I told him you were unreachable. He's threatening to come to San Francisco. Sarah's blood went cold. What is it? Myles asked, reading her expression. She turned the phone so he could see the message, watched his jaw tighten as he processed the implications. He doesn't know which hotel, Myles said. He will. Bruce is persistent when he wants something, and right now he wants access to my professional network and my ability to co-sign loans. Sarah typed a rapid response to Dennis. Do not give him any information. I'll handle it, and set the phone face down on the table. I'm sorry, this is your crisis. I shouldn't be dragging my ex-fiancé drama into it. Sarah. Myles waited until she looked at him. If he shows up at the St. Regis, we handle him the same way we're handling Tessa, together. That's the deal. That wasn't part of the contract. Consider it an addendum. His mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Besides, you just spent the last hour convincing me to let you help. Seems only fair that I return the favor. Sarah felt something crack open in her chest. Not the careful professional distance she'd been maintaining, but something deeper and more dangerous. The realization that Myles wasn't just a client she was protecting. He was becoming someone who saw her clearly enough to know when she needed protecting too. Okay, she said, together. They finished lunch while Sarah walked Myles through Bruce's greatest hits, the way he'd gaslit her about her own career ambitions, the secretary he'd left her for, the failing business he'd somehow convinced himself Sarah was obligated to rescue. Myles listened with the focused attention of someone cataloging evidence, and by the time they paid the check and stepped out into the San Francisco afternoon, Sarah felt lighter than she had in months. Where to now? Myles asked, falling into step beside her as they navigated the crowded sidewalk. The museum. Unless you have a better idea? The museum's perfect. He glanced at her, and there was something different in his expression. Less guarded, more present. Thank you. For this. For making me leave the hotel. You're welcome. Though I should warn you, if we run into anyone from the conference, we're going to have to hold hands and look appropriately married. I think I can manage that. They walked in comfortable silence toward the museum, and when Myles's hand found hers somewhere around the third block, Sarah told herself it was just practice, just part of the performance they'd been hired to deliver. But when his thumb brushed across her knuckles, a small, absent gesture that sent warmth spiraling up her arm, Sarah realized the most dangerous part of this arrangement wasn't the stalker or the ex-fiancé or the high-stakes gala they had to survive tonight. It was the fact that every hour she spent with Myles Anderson made it harder to remember why she'd built walls in the first place. And by the time they reached the museum steps, she'd stopped trying to remember at all. Chapter 5. The Lean In. The San Francisco Museum of Modern Art was having a quiet Saturday afternoon, which meant it was still more crowded than Myles would have preferred, but manageable enough that he could breathe. Sarah had insisted on the contemporary wing, because if we're building a fake history, we need specific memories to reference. And now they were standing in front of a massive Rothko that looked like a sunset bleeding into itself. "What do you see?" Sarah questioned, her voice low enough that it didn't carry beyond their immediate space. "Expensive paint on canvas." She elbowed him gently. "That's not an answer." "It's an honest answer." But Myles looked at the painting again, trying to see what she saw. "What do you see?" "Longing. The way two colors can exist right next to each other and never quite touch." She tilted her head. "Or maybe I'm projecting. Your therapist would probably say the same thing mine did." Sarah laughed, and the sound made something in Myles's chest loosen. They'd been walking through the museum for 40 minutes now, and somewhere around the Pollock installation, something had shifted. The performance had started to feel less like work and more like... He didn't have a word for what it felt like. "There," Sarah said suddenly, pointing to a smaller piece in the corner. "That's the one." It was a photography series, black and white images of hands, a surgeon's hands mid-operation, a pianist's hands on keys, a sculptor's hands shaping clay, and in the final frame, an elderly person's hands, gnarled with arthritis, simply resting on a table. Myles went still. "The artist's statement says it's about identity and loss," Sarah said quietly, reading from the placard. "How we define ourselves by what our hands can do, and what happens when they can't do it anymore." "Sarah." "I know." She turned to face him, and her eyes were gentle in a way that made his throat tight. "I'm not trying to... I just thought you should see it, because you're not the only person who's had to rebuild themselves after their hands stopped working the way they used to." Myles looked at the photographs again, at the surgeon's steady grip, at the final image of stillness and acceptance. "I haven't gotten to the acceptance part yet," he admitted. "I know, but maybe you don't have to do it alone." The words settled between them with a weight that had nothing to do with their fake marriage contract and everything to do with the fact that Sarah kept seeing past his defenses before he'd consciously decided to lower them. "We should keep moving," he said, because the alternative was standing in front of this exhibition having feelings he didn't know how to process. "The gala starts in 4 hours, and we still need..." His phone buzzed, then buzzed again, then started ringing. Myles pulled it out and felt his stomach drop. 6 missed calls, 12 texts, all from the same block number he knew was Tessa. "Let me see," Sarah said, already reaching for the phone. He handed it over and watched her face go professionally blank as she scrolled through the messages. That expression meant she was reading something that was going to be a problem. It was familiar. "She knows about Bruce," Sarah stated. "What?" "She's been digging into my background. She knows about the broken engagement. She's threatening to expose me at the gala as a fraud who's using you to..." Sarah's voice flat. "To rebuild my own damaged reputation after my fiancé left me." "That's insane." "That's Tessa." Sarah handed the phone back. "She's escalating, which means we need to escalate our response." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we stop playing defense and start playing offense. I have information on her, the prior restraining order, the litigation history. I was planning to use it as leverage if she pushed too hard, but if she's already going nuclear..." Then we go nuclear first, Myles finished. Exactly. Sarah pulled out her own phone. I'm calling hotel security, not to report her yet, but to put them on alert. And then I'm calling my investigator to expedite the full background report. If Tessa wants to play the exposure game, we're going to make sure she understands exactly what we can expose about her. Myles watched her shift into attorney mode. The rapid-fire texts, the clipped professional voice on the phone call, the absolute certainty that she could handle this. It should have made him feel obsolete again, that reflexive inadequacy that had plagued him all morning. Instead, it made him feel something else entirely. Safe. The realization was so unexpected that he actually took a step back. Sarah glanced up from her phone, concerned. You okay? Yes, He stopped, searching for words. You're extraordinary. You know that, right? Sarah's fingers stilled on her phone screen. Myles. I mean it. Bruce was an idiot. Not just for leaving you, but for making you feel like your competence was something to apologize for. It's not, it's... He gestured vaguely at her phone, at the museum, at the entire situation they'd somehow found themselves in. It's the most attractive thing about you. The words came out before he could edit them, and the resulting silence was deafening. Attractive, Sarah repeated, her voice carefully neutral. I meant professionally attractive, as in impressive, compelling, not... Myles stopped because the expression on Sarah's face made it clear. Backtracking was only making it worse. I'm going to stop talking now. That's probably wise. But Sarah was smiling, a real smile, not the professional one she deployed for investors or the careful one she used when she was managing his anxiety. For the record, you're not exactly terrible yourself, professionally speaking. Professionally speaking. Completely professionally. Her eyes were bright with something that might have been amusement or might have been something more dangerous. Though I should probably mention that if we're going to sell this marriage tonight, we're going to need to be comfortable with physical proximity that goes beyond hand-holding. Myles's pulse kicked. How much beyond? Dancing. The gala has a formal dance component. Married couples dance together. Sarah slipped her phone back into her purse. When's the last time you danced with someone? Define danced. Waltz, foxtrot. You know, the usual that happens at formal events when there's a live band and an expectation of romantic performance. Then never. I was always terrible at that kind of thing. Too much coordination required. He held up his right hand, the tremor barely visible, but ever present. And now I have a built-in excuse to avoid it. Except tonight, you don't get to avoid it, because if we don't dance, people will notice, and Tessa will absolutely use it as evidence that we're not really married. Sarah moved closer, close enough that Myles could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive that he'd been noticing all day. So, we're going to practice, right here. In the museum. In the museum. She held out her hand. Trust me. Myles looked at her hand, steady, certain, reaching for him, and realized he did trust her, more than he'd trusted anyone in years, more than made sense, given they'd known each other less than 24 hours. He took her hand. Sarah stepped into his space with the confidence of someone who'd done this before, placing his right hand at her waist and keeping his left hand clasped in hers. The tremor doesn't matter, she muttered quietly. I can feel it, but it doesn't affect your ability to lead. You just need to commit to the movement. There's no music. Then we'll imagine it. She started moving, a simple box step that Myles's muscle memory recognized from some long-ago wedding he'd been forced to attend. See? You're not terrible at this. I'm standing in a museum slow dancing with my fake wife. I think terrible is relative. Sarah laughed, and the sound reverberated through his chest where her hand rested. They moved through the gallery in silence for a moment, navigating around other museum-goers who either didn't notice or were too polite to comment on the couple waltzing past the Rothko. Can I ask you something? Sarah said. That's still a dangerous opening. When you were operating, before the accident, what did it feel like? Myles almost stopped moving, but Sarah's hand at his shoulder steadied him. Why do you want to know? Because if I'm going to defend you and your work, I need to understand what you lost, not the technical details, the emotional ones. It was a fair question. It was also the question no one had asked him in 3 years, including his therapist. It felt like flying, Myles said finally, or maybe like conducting an orchestra. Everything had to happen in perfect sequence. Every cut, every suture, every decision. And when it worked, when you brought someone back from the edge and their heart started beating strong and steady again, he stopped, searching for words. It felt like I was doing what I was built to do, like every choice I'd ever made had led to that exact moment in that exact operating room. And now I watch other people do it and try to convince myself that building the device is enough. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Most days, I almost believe it. Sarah's hand tightened on his shoulder. The EMS is enough, Myles. It's more than enough. You're saving lives in a completely different way. I know that intellectually, but knowing something and feeling it are different things. Yes, Sarah said quietly. They are. They danced past a security guard who was trying very hard to pretend he wasn't watching them, past a young couple taking selfies in front of a Warhol, past an elderly man sitting on a bench, smiling at them with the indulgent expression of someone who remembered what it felt like to be young and in love. Except they weren't in love. They were performing love, which was completely different. Except somewhere in the last hour, Myles had stopped being entirely sure where the performance ended and something else began. "Sarah," he said, and his voice came out lower than he'd intended. She looked up at him, and her eyes were very green and very close. "Yes? I think we're going to be okay. Tonight. At the gala. I think—" He stopped, because what he wanted to say was, "I think I'm starting to care about you in ways that have nothing to do with this contract," and that was absolutely not something he could say 12 hours into a fake marriage. "I think we make a good team." Sarah's expression softened into something that looked almost sad. "We do, but Myles—" "I know. 4 days. That's the deal. I'm not trying to—" He stopped again, because he wasn't sure what he was trying to do. "I just wanted you to know that this, today, has been the first time in 3 years that I've felt like something other than a surgeon who can't operate anymore. So thank you for making me leave the hotel, for making me talk about things I don't talk about, for—" He gestured vaguely at the museum around them. "For this." "You're welcome." Sarah's voice was very quiet. "And for the record, you're the first person in 6 months who's made me feel like something other than a woman whose fiancé left her for someone less complicated. So we're even." They stopped moving, standing in the middle of the gallery with their hands still clasped and their faces close enough that Myles could count the faint freckles across her nose. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and the weight of everything they weren't saying. Myles's phone buzzed again, shattering the moment. Sarah stepped back, the professional distance snapping back into place so quickly it was almost physically painful to watch. "We should head back to the hotel. We need to get ready for tonight." "Right, the gala." The gala. Sarah smoothed her dress, a nervous gesture he was starting to recognize. "Where we're going to be the most convincing married couple anyone has ever seen. And where Tessa is going to try to destroy us. And where we're going to make sure she fails." Sarah's voice carried that steel-reinforced certainty again, the one that made juries sit up and pay attention. "Because we're not just good at performing, Myles. We're good at winning, and tonight we're going to win." They walked out of the museum into the late afternoon sunlight, and Myles reached for Sarah's hand without thinking about it. She laced her fingers through his with the same easy familiarity, and if anyone had asked him in that moment whether they were really married, he wasn't entirely sure what he would have said. because the line between performance and reality was getting thinner with every passing hour, and by the time they reached the St. Regis, Myles had stopped trying to identify where one ended and the other began. The presidential suite felt different when they returned, less like a sterile luxury accommodation and more like a space they'd actually inhabited together. Sarah's laptop was still open on the coffee table. His jacket was draped over the back of a chair. The coffee cups from this morning sat in the sink, a small domestic detail that felt startlingly intimate. "I'm going to shower and start getting ready," Sarah said, already moving toward her bedroom. "The investigator is sending the full Tessa report within the hour. I'll review it and brief you before we go down." "Sarah." She stopped, turned. "Thank you," Myles said, "for today, for all of it." She smiled, and it was soft and genuine and made his chest ache. "You already thanked me, multiple times." "I know, but I wanted to make sure you knew I meant it." "I know you did." She hesitated, then added, "Get some rest. Tonight's going to be intense." She disappeared into her room, and Myles stood in the living room for a long moment, staring at the closed door and trying to process the fact that somewhere between the trattoria and the museum, something fundamental had shifted. He'd hired Sarah to play his wife for 4 days, but standing in the aftermath of their afternoon together, the conversations, the confessions, the dancing in a museum gallery, Myles realized the most dangerous thing about this arrangement wasn't that they might get caught. It was that he was starting to wish they didn't have to be caught at all. His phone buzzed one more time, another message from Tessa's blocked number. "See you tonight. Can't wait to meet the real Mrs. Anderson, if she exists." Myles deleted the message and headed to his own room to prepare for the performance of his life. He just wasn't entirely sure anymore which parts were performance and which parts were something else entirely. Intermission. If you are enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. Chapter 6, Almost. The gala dress had been waiting in Sarah's room when they returned from the museum, a midnight blue silk gown that Dennis had arranged from some designer whose name Sarah couldn't pronounce. There was a note attached in Dennis's distinctive scrawl, "Make it convincing. The entire TechMed investment community will be watching." No pressure then. Sarah stood in front of the bathroom mirror, applying the last of her makeup with hands that were almost steady, and tried not to think about the way Myles had looked at her in the museum. The way his voice had gone rough when he talked about what he'd lost, the way dancing with him had felt less like practice and more like... Her phone buzzed. A text. "Investigator report Tessa Astors, confidential." Sarah opened the file and felt her blood run cold. The prior restraining order was worse than she'd thought. Tessa hadn't just stalked her previous victim. She'd broken into his home. Twice. The second time, she'd been found in his bedroom at 3 a.m, wearing his deceased wife's clothes. The psychiatric evaluation that followed painted a picture of someone with severe attachment disorder and a documented history of delusional thinking. The restraining order had been granted for 5 years. It expired 6 months ago, which meant Tessa was legally free to do this all over again. Sarah's hands tightened on her phone as she scrolled through the rest of the report. The pattern was unmistakable. Tessa fixated on successful men who'd experienced recent loss or trauma. The tech executive had lost his wife to cancer. Before him, there'd been a venture capitalist whose daughter had died in a car accident. And Myles had lost his surgical career, the thing that had defined his entire identity. The facts were clear. Tessa was a predator who specifically targeted wounded prey. Sarah saved the report to her encrypted drive and stepped out of the bathroom. The dress fit perfectly, which was somehow more unsettling than if it hadn't. She looked like someone who belonged at a high-stakes gala, someone who could stand next to Myles Anderson and make the world believe they were madly in love, someone who wasn't currently spiraling into the realization that this situation was significantly more dangerous than she'd initially assessed. A knock at her door. "Sarah, are you ready?" She opened the door and forgot how to breathe. Myles stood in the hallway wearing a tuxedo that had clearly been tailored specifically for him, and the effect was devastating. The formal wear somehow emphasized rather than concealed the controlled strength in his frame, the sharp intelligence in his eyes, the barely visible tension in his jaw that suggested he was just as nervous as she was. "You look—" He stopped, and something shifted in his expression. "I don't have words that won't sound like a line." "Try anyway. You look like every reason I've ever had for keeping my personal life separate from my professional one just became completely irrelevant." His voice was rough, which is probably not what I should be saying to my fake wife 10 minutes before we have to convince 300 people we're really married. Sarah's heart was doing something complicated and arrhythmic in her chest. "Myles—" "I know. 4 days. Contract. Professional arrangement." He held out his hand. "But for tonight, can we just pretend it's real?" "Yes." Sarah took his hand, and the contact sent electricity up her arm. At this moment, the man standing in front of her was impressive, handsome, confident, and the sexiest thing she had ever seen. "Okay," she said quietly, "but we need to talk about Tessa first. The investigator's report came through." She walked him through the findings, watching his expression shift from concern to barely controlled fury as she detailed the pattern of escalation, the prior break-ins, the psychiatric evaluation. "She's done this before," Myles said flatly. "This exact thing, and no one thought to warn me?" "The restraining order was sealed. It only shows up if you know exactly what you're looking for." Sarah pulled up a photo on her phone, Tessa at the previous victim's preliminary hearing, her expression unnervingly calm. "But now we know, which means we can use it." "How?" "By making it very clear that if she causes any kind of scene tonight, I will immediately file for an emergency restraining order based on established pattern of behavior. The prior order gives us precedent. Her escalating contact with you over the past 3 months gives us evidence. And the fact that she's made explicit threats about tonight gives us grounds for immediate judicial intervention." Myles was quiet for a long moment. "You're going to threaten her? Publicly?" "Only if she forces my hand. But yes, if she approaches us tonight, if she tries to expose us or cause a scene, I'm going to make sure she understands exactly what the legal consequences will be. Not might be, will be." "That's—" He stopped, and his expression shifted into something that looked like awe mixed with concern. "That's incredibly aggressive." "That's my job." Sarah met his eyes. "You hired me to protect your assets. That includes protecting you from someone who has a documented history of breaking into people's homes. So yes, I'm going to be aggressive, because the alternative is letting her destroy everything you've built, and I'm not going to let that happen." Myles moved closer, and suddenly the space between them felt charged with more than just strategy and professional determination. "I don't know whether to be terrified or turned on," he said quietly. Sarah's breath caught. "Myles—" "That was inappropriate. I'm sorry. He stopped, and his hand came up to cup her face with a gentleness that completely contradicted the intensity of the moment. "You're about to go into battle for me, and I don't know how to process that without wanting to—" "Without wanting to what?" His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and Sarah felt her entire nervous system light up. "Without wanting to kiss you until we both forget this is supposed to be fake." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest and absolutely impossible to take back. Sarah knew she should step away, should remind him about the contract, the 4-day limit, the fact that they'd known each other less than 36 hours, and anything beyond professional collaboration was a spectacularly bad idea. Instead, she heard herself say, "Then maybe you should." Myles went very still. "Sarah, we're supposed to look convincingly married tonight. Married people kiss each other, so maybe—" She stopped, her heart hammering. "Maybe we should practice, so it looks natural when we have to do it in front of 300 witnesses." It was a lie. It was absolutely a lie, and they both knew it, but Myles didn't call her on it. Instead, his other hand came up to frame her face, his touch careful and deliberate, and making her feel like something precious rather than something convenient. Last chance to change your mind, he said, his voice low and rough. I'm not going to change my mind. Myles kissed her. It wasn't the performative kiss she'd been expecting, the kind of careful, camera-ready contact that would look good from a distance but feel empty up close. This was something else entirely. His mouth was warm and certain against hers, and when she made a small sound of surprise, he deepened the kiss with a controlled intensity that made her knees weak. Sarah's hands came up to grip his lapels, anchoring herself as the kiss shifted from tentative to something that felt dangerously close to desperate. Myles's right hand slid into her hair, the faint tremor she'd noticed before completely absent as he held her, like she was the only solid thing in a world that had gone unstable. This was a mistake. This was absolutely a mistake. But when Myles pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against hers, both of them breathing hard, Sarah couldn't bring herself to regret it. That was, Myles started. Practice, Sarah finished, her voice unsteady. That was practice. Right, practice. But his hands were still in her hair, his body still pressed against hers in the narrow hallway between their bedrooms. Very convincing practice. Extremely convincing. Neither of them moved. Sarah's phone buzzed in her clutch, a reminder alarm for the gala start time. The sound broke the spell, and they stepped apart with the awkward synchronization of people who just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. We should... Myles gestured vaguely toward the door. Yes, the gala, right. Sarah smoothed her dress with shaking hands. Are you ready for this? To pretend to be married to you in front of 300 people after that kiss? Absolutely not. He offered his arm with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But I'm going to do it anyway. Sarah took his arm, hyper-aware of every point of contact between them. They walked to the elevator in silence, and when the doors closed, trapping them in the small space together, Myles turned to her. Sarah, that kiss was practice, she said firmly. That's all it was. We needed to know what it would feel like so we could do it convincingly if Tessa forces a public moment. That's all. That's all, Myles echoed, but his eyes said something completely different. The elevator descended toward the ballroom, and Sarah tried to steady her breathing, her racing pulse, the feeling that she'd just stepped off a cliff and hadn't yet hit the ground. The doors opened onto the pre-gala reception area, already crowded with investors and surgeons and the kind of people who wore their wealth like a second skin. Sarah felt Myles's posture shift beside her, the surgeon's careful control sliding back into place, the professional masks settling over whatever he'd been feeling 30 seconds ago. Ready? He murmured. Ready. They stepped into the crowd, and Sarah felt dozens of eyes track their movement. Dr. Flynn was near the bar, deep in conversation with Harrison Calhoun. Dr. Turcotte was by the windows, already watching them with undisguised curiosity. And somewhere in this crowd was Tessa Astors, waiting for her moment to strike. Myles's hand found the small of Sarah's back, and the touch sent heat spiraling through her that had nothing to do with the performance they were about to deliver. There's Turcotte, Myles said quietly. We should... Dr. Anderson, a woman's voice, bright and carrying. I've been looking everywhere for you. They turned, and Sarah felt Myles go rigid beside her. Tessa Astors stood 5 feet away, wearing a red dress that was just slightly too formal for the occasion, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked directly at Sarah, and her expression was pure calculation. The wife, Tessa said, and the emphasis on the last word made it sound like an accusation. How wonderful to see you. Myles has told me so much about you. Funny, Sarah said, her voice carrying that dangerous calm that made opposing counsel nervous. He's never mentioned you at all. Sarah realized Tessa lived in a make-believe world. Tessa's smile sharpened. Oh, I'm sure he hasn't. Myles has always been very private about his personal life, which is why I was so surprised to hear he'd gotten married. 6 months ago, wasn't it? Such a quick turnaround after everything. The implication hung in the air like poison. Sarah felt Myles's hand tighten against her back, a warning or a plea, she couldn't tell. "After what, exactly?" Sarah asked, her voice deadly quiet. "After his accident, of course." Tessa's eyes were bright with malice. "It must have been so difficult for you, watching him struggle to accept that his surgical career was over. All that grief and loss and—" She paused delicately. "Vulnerability. I imagine that's quite attractive to a certain kind of woman." Sarah felt rage flood through her, white-hot and clarifying. This was it, the moment Tessa had been building toward, the public confrontation designed to make them look unstable and their marriage look opportunistic. And Sarah was about to end it. "Ms. Astors," she said, and her voice carried across the immediate area, drawing attention from nearby conversations. "I'm going to give you one chance to walk away from this conversation before it becomes a legal problem for you." Tessa's smile faltered. "I'm sorry?" "I'm an asset protection attorney, which means I'm very good at research." Sarah pulled out her phone with deliberate precision. "Would you like me to read aloud from your psychiatric evaluation? Or should we skip straight to the part where you broke into Stephen Chen's home wearing his dead wife's clothing?" The color drained from Tessa's face. "That's sealed," she whispered. "Sealed doesn't mean inaccessible. Not to someone who knows where to look." Sarah took a step forward, and her voice dropped to something only the three of them could hear. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave this gala. You're going to leave this hotel. And you're going to stop contacting my husband. If you don't, I will file for an emergency restraining order first thing Monday morning. And I will make sure every detail of your prior order becomes part of the public record. Do we understand each other?" Tessa's hands were shaking. "You can't." "I absolutely can, and I will, because unlike the men you've targeted before, Myles has something they didn't, me, and I don't lose." Sarah's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "So make your choice. Walk away now, or spend the next 6 months explaining to every judge in San Francisco why you thought stalking someone was an appropriate response to rejection." For a long, terrible moment, Tessa just stared at her. Then her gaze shifted to Myles, desperate and pleading. "Myles, please, I just wanted to talk to you. I just wanted—" "You need to leave," Myles said, and his voice was flat and final. "Sarah's right. This ends tonight. If you contact me again, we'll pursue every legal option available. I'm sorry it came to this, but you didn't leave us a choice." Tessa's expression crumpled. For a moment, Sarah almost felt sorry for her, almost saw past the stalking and the threats to the broken person underneath. Then Tessa's face hardened into something ugly. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "Both of you. This isn't over." "Yes," Sarah said quietly. "It is." Tessa turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor with sharp, angry precision. Sarah watched her go, tracking her movement until she disappeared into the elevator bank. Only then did she let herself breathe. "Sarah," Myles started. "Not here." Her voice was shaking. "Not in front of everyone, just hold me. Like you mean it. So everyone sees that she didn't win." Myles pulled her into his arms without hesitation, and Sarah buried her face against his shoulder, her entire body trembling with adrenaline and relief and the aftermath of controlled rage. "You were magnificent," he murmured against her hair. "Absolutely terrifying and completely magnificent. I threatened to destroy her life in front of 50 witnesses. You protected mine." His arms tightened around her. "Thank you for fighting that battle, for being exactly as formidable as I needed you to be." Sarah pulled back just enough to look at him, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was something that looked dangerously close to— "Dr. Anderson," Harrison Calhoun's voice cut through the moment. "And Mrs. Anderson, that was quite the display." They turned, still in each other's arms, to find Calhoun standing with Dr. Flynn and Dr. Massey, all three of them watching with expressions ranging from impressed to concerned. "I apologize for the disruption," Sarah said, forcing her voice back into professional calm. That woman has been harassing my husband for months. I felt it was time to establish clear boundaries." "Clearly," Dr. Massey said, but she was smiling. "Remind me never to get on your bad side, Mrs. Anderson." "Sarah, please, and I promise I'm much more pleasant when people aren't threatening my family." The word slipped out before she could stop it. Family, as if she and Myles were actually the unit they were pretending to be. But no one seemed to notice the slip, and Myles's hand tightened on her waist in what might have been warning or might have been something else. "Well," Dr. Flynn said, "I think I speak for all of us when I say that was the most interesting pre-gala reception in recent memory. Shall we move into the ballroom? I believe they're about to start the formal program." They filed into the ballroom together, and Sarah felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes tracking their movement. The story of the confrontation was already spreading through the crowd. She could see it in the sideways glances, the whispered conversations, the way people looked at her and Myles with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "Everyone's staring," Myles murmured. "Let them. We just established that we're not to be messed with. That's good for your professional reputation." "Is it good for yours?" Sarah considered the question. 6 months ago, she would have been horrified at the idea of making such a public scene. But now, "Yes," she said, "I think it is." The ballroom was transformed from the morning's investor breakfast, chandeliers dimmed to flattering amber, tables set with elaborate centerpieces, a live band setting up on the stage. Their assigned seats were at the head table, directly in the sightline of everyone who mattered. Perfect. They settled into their chairs, and Myles's hand found hers under the table, lacing their fingers together with easy familiarity. Sarah told herself it was still performance, still part of the act they'd agreed to maintain. But when he leaned over to whisper, "Are you okay?" and his breath ghosted across her neck, sending shivers down her spine, Sarah realized she'd stopped being able to distinguish between the performance and whatever was happening underneath it. "I'm fine," she whispered back. "Are you?" "I will be, as long as you're here." The words settled over her like a promise or a warning or both, and Sarah realized with sudden crystalline clarity the most dangerous thing about tonight by far was Myles himself. Myles looked at her like she was the only person in the room who mattered, and Sarah wanted desperately for it to be real. The lights dimmed further, and the master of ceremonies took the stage to begin the evening's program. Sarah felt Myles's thumb brush across her knuckles, that same absent, intimate gesture from the museum, and tried to focus on anything other than the warmth spreading through her chest. 4 days, she reminded herself. That was the deal. But as the evening unfolded around them, speeches and toasts and the careful choreography of professional networking, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere between the museum and the ballroom, between the practice kiss and the public confrontation, the 4-day limit had stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like a countdown to something she wasn't ready to lose. Chapter 7. The Reveal. The dance floor opened after dinner, and Sarah knew what was coming before Myles even stood and offered his hand. "Ready to put that museum practice to use?" Myles's voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. Sarah took his hand and let him lead her onto the floor, hyper-aware of the dozens of eyes tracking their movement. The band was playing something slow and elegant, a standard that probably had a name she should know, and when Myles pulled her into the proper waltz position, his hand settling at her waist with practiced ease, she felt her breath hitch. "You're tense," he murmured, guiding her through the first few steps. "Everyone's watching." "Let them watch. That's the point, remember?" His hand tightened fractionally at her waist. "Besides, after what you just did to Tessa, I think everyone's more intimidated than judgmental." Sarah smiled despite the nerves. "I may have been slightly aggressive." "You were perfect." Myles spun her gently, and she followed the movement without thinking. "You were exactly what I needed you to be." The words echoed what he'd said upstairs, before the kiss that was supposed to be practice and had felt like anything but. Sarah looked up at him and found him already watching her, his expression unguarded in a way that made her chest ache. "Myles, I know what you're going to say. 4 days. contract, professional boundaries. He pulled her slightly closer, close enough that she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat through his tuxedo. But Sarah, I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you now before I lose my nerve. Sarah's pulse kicked into overdrive. This isn't the time. It's exactly the time, because in about 30 seconds, Dr. Turcotte is going to cut in and ask you to dance, and then Dr. Flynn is going to corner me about the licensing terms, and we won't have another moment alone until this entire nightmare evening is over. His voice dropped even lower. So, I'm going to say this now, while I still can. The accident that ended my surgical career wasn't random. Sarah's feet faltered, and Myles steadied her automatically, his surgeon's reflexes overriding the tremor that usually plagued his right hand. What do you mean, not random? I mean, I was driving home from the hospital after a 72-hour shift. I mean, I'd done 3 emergency surgeries back to back, and I was so exhausted I could barely see straight. And I mean, I made the choice to get behind the wheel anyway, because there was another surgery scheduled in 6 hours, and I needed to go home and sleep and get back before anyone noticed I was operating on fumes. His jaw tightened. The other driver ran a red light. That part was random. But me being too tired and unfocused to react fast enough? That was my choice, my arrogance, my inability to admit I had limits. Sarah's throat constricted. Myles? I never told anyone. Not my family, not my colleagues, not the medical board. The official story is that it was just an accident. Wrong place, wrong time. No one's fault. But I know the truth. If I'd been rested, if I'd been sharp, I could have avoided that collision. Instead, I destroyed my career because I was too proud to admit I needed to stop. The confession hung between them, raw and devastating, and Sarah understood with sudden clarity why he'd been so resistant to accepting her help, why every act of competence on her part felt like an indictment of his own failures. That's why you hate needing people, she said quietly, because you think needing help cost you everything. Yes. His voice was barely above a whisper. And then you showed up, and you were so capable and so certain, and every time you solved a problem I couldn't solve, it felt like proof I was right, that I'm inadequate at taking care of myself, that I'll always need someone else to save me from my own limitations. Myles, that's not what this is. Sarah's free hand came up to his shoulder, grounding them both. What happened to you was a tragedy. A preventable tragedy, maybe, but not a moral failing. You were exhausted because you were trying to save lives. That's not arrogance. That's dedication that crossed a line, yes, but it doesn't make you weak or inadequate, or doesn't it? His eyes were dark with something that looked like grief. Because from where I'm standing, I destroyed my life through sheer stubbornness, and then 3 years later, I had to hire a fake wife to protect me from a stalker because I couldn't handle the situation on my own. That's not exactly a track record that inspires confidence. Stop. Sarah's voice came out sharper than she intended, sharp enough that Myles actually stopped moving, and they stood in the middle of the dance floor while other couples flowed around them like water around a stone. You didn't hire me because you're weak. You hired me because you're smart enough to recognize when you need specialized expertise. That's not failure. That's survival. Sarah. No, let me finish. She could feel people notice they'd stopped dancing, but she didn't care. You made a mistake 3 years ago, a human mistake that had catastrophic consequences, and instead of letting it destroy you, you built something extraordinary out of the wreckage. The EMS isn't a consolation prize, Myles. It's proof that you can take the worst moment of your life and transform it into something that will save thousands of people. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing I've ever seen anyone do. Myles was staring at her like she'd just performed surgery on him without anesthesia, shocked and raw and unable to look away. I don't know how to believe that, he said finally. Then believe me, believing it. Sarah started moving again, pulling him back into the rhythm of the dance. Because I don't lie to my clients, and I'm telling you right now, you're not broken, you're not inadequate, you're just human, And humans need help sometimes. That's not a character flaw, it's just a fact. They danced in silence for a long moment, and Sarah could feel something shifting between them. Not the careful professional distance or the performative intimacy, but something more fundamental. A recognition that they'd both been carrying wounds they'd not let anyone see, and somehow, impossibly, they'd found someone who could look directly at those wounds without flinching. "Can I tell you something now?" Sarah asked quietly. "Please." Bruce didn't leave me because I was too successful. He left because I let him make me smaller, and he got addicted to that feeling of being the bigger person in the relationship. And when I finally stopped shrinking, when I accepted the keynote and the partnership track, and all the things I'd been holding back to make room for his ego, he couldn't handle the fact that I was taking up space again. She took a shaky breath. "So, when you say you hate needing people, I understand. Because I spent 2 years confusing need with love, and when it ended, I convinced myself the lesson was not to need anyone again, to never be vulnerable enough to get hurt." "But," Myles prompted gently, "but I think maybe the lesson was that I was vulnerable with the wrong person, that the problem wasn't the vulnerability itself. It was trusting someone who saw my strength as a threat instead of a gift." She looked up at him, and her voice dropped to something just barely audible over the music. "And I think maybe you're dealing with the same thing. You're not afraid of needing help. You're afraid of needing help from people who will use that need against you." Myles's hand tightened on her waist, and his expression was so unguarded it made her heart ache. "I wouldn't," he said, "use your vulnerability against you, in case that wasn't clear." "I know, and I wouldn't use yours against you either." "I know." They moved through the rest of the song in silence, and when the music shifted into something faster, more upbeat, they stayed locked together in their own slower rhythm. Sarah was vaguely aware of Dr. Turcotte approaching, probably to claim that promised dance, but Myles pulled her fractionally closer, and Turcotte seemed to think better of the interruption. "Sarah," Myles said, and his voice was rough with something that sounded like hope and terror in equal measure. "This thing between us, I know. I don't think I can go back to pretending it's performance. I know that too. So what do we do?" Sarah didn't have an answer, because the truth was in 36 hours the conference would end, the 4-day contract would expire, and they'd both return to their separate lives, her to San Francisco and her corner office, him to Palo Alto and his medical device company, and whatever this was would dissolve like it had never existed, unless they choose something different. "We have 2 days left," Sarah said finally. 2 days to figure out if this is real or if it's just proximity and adrenaline and the fact that we're both so starved for a genuine connection that we're mistaking professional intimacy for something more. And if it is real, then we deal with that when the 4 days are up, together. She managed a small smile. "One crisis at a time, remember?" Myles laughed. The sound startled and genuine, and made something warm unfold in Sarah's chest. "You're going to be terrible for my carefully controlled life, aren't you?" "Probably. Is that a deal breaker?" "Absolutely not." The song ended, and this time when Dr. Turcotte approached, Myles released her with visible reluctance. Sarah let Turcotte lead her through a perfectly pleasant dance while Dr. Massey claimed Myles. She tried very hard not to watch him across the ballroom. She failed spectacularly. When the dance set finally ended and Sarah excused herself to the restroom, she found herself standing in front of the mirror, reapplying lipstick and trying to process. Everything had just changed. Myles had told her the truth about his accident. The truth, the one he'd been carrying alone for 3 years. And she'd told him the truth about Bruce and her own fear of vulnerability. Somehow, impossibly, neither of them had used those truths as weapons. They'd use them as bridges instead. Sarah's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "You think you won, but this isn't over. I know things about Dr. Anderson that you don't. Things that will destroy him if they come out. Call off your legal threats, or I'll make sure everyone knows what he's really hiding." Sarah's blood ran cold. She screenshotted the message and forwarded it immediately to her investigator, then headed back into the ballroom with her professional armor snapping back into place. She found Myles near the bar, deep in conversation with Harrison Calhoun, and when he saw her expression, his entire body went on alert. "Excuse me," he said to Calhoun, already moving toward her. "Sarah, what's wrong?" She showed him the message. Myles's face went white, then carefully blank. "She's bluffing." "Is she?" "Yes, there's nothing." He stopped, and something flickered across his expression. Something that looked like panic. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you before, but Dr. Anderson!" A woman's voice, cheerful and carrying. "There you are." They both turned to find a woman in her 60s approaching, wearing an elegant black dress and a smile that suggested she knew exactly who Myles was and was delighted to have found him. "Dr. Patterson," Myles said, and his voice had gone very careful. "I wasn't expecting to see you here. I'm on the conference advisory board. I wouldn't miss it." Dr. Patterson's eyes slid to Sarah with undisguised curiosity. "And you must be the new wife I've been hearing about. How wonderful. Myles, you dark horse. I had no idea you were even dating anyone." "We kept it quiet," Myles said, and Sarah heard the strain beneath the pleasant tone. "Dr. Patterson was my attending physician after the accident." "I was indeed." Dr. Patterson's expression softened. "How's the hand, Myles? Any improvement?" "No, but I'm managing." "And the device? I heard the Phase 2 results were extraordinary." "They were. We're moving into Phase 3 trials pending the licensing agreement." "Wonderful. Just wonderful." Dr. Patterson smiled at Sarah. "You must be very proud of him. What he's built from such a difficult situation, it's remarkable." "I am," Sarah said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised her. Dr. Patterson excused herself to join another conversation, and the moment she was out of earshot, Sarah turned to Myles. "What were you about to tell me?" "Not here. Upstairs. After—" He glanced around the ballroom. "After we've made enough of an appearance that we can leave without it looking strange." "Myles, please, I need to tell you properly, and I can't do that in a room full of people." His hand found hers, and the tremor was back, faint but present. "But I promise I'll tell you everything. No more secrets." Sarah wanted to push. Every instinct she had was screaming that whatever Myles was hiding was important, possibly dangerous, and definitely the thing Tessa was threatening to expose. But she also saw the fear in his eyes, the same vulnerability he'd shown on the dance floor when he'd confessed about the accident. And she realized that pushing now would be using his honesty against him, exactly the thing she'd just promised not to do. "Okay," she said quietly. "But the second we're alone, you tell me everything. Because if Tessa's threatening to expose something, I need to know what it is so I can protect you from it." "I know, I will." He squeezed her hand. "Thank you for giving me a chance to explain properly." They stayed at the gala for another hour, performing the role of devoted married couple with a practiced ease that felt less like acting and more like muscle memory. But beneath the surface, Sarah's mind was racing through possibilities, cataloging threats, preparing for whatever revelation was coming. When they finally made their excuses and headed back to the presidential suite, Sarah's entire body was vibrating with tension. The elevator ride up was silent. The walk down the hallway to their suite was silent. Myles unlocked the door with hands that were shaking badly enough that it took him 2 tries to get the keycard to register. Inside, Sarah set down her clutch and turned to face him. "Tell me," she said simply. Myles moved to the windows, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension. "The medical board investigation," he said finally, "after the accident. They cleared me of any wrongdoing, said it was just bad luck, wrong place, wrong time. But there was a preliminary review before they made that determination, and during that review they looked at my surgery schedule for the month leading up to the accident." Sarah's stomach dropped. And they found a pattern. 72-hour shifts, back-to-back emergency surgeries, operating times that suggested I was working well beyond what was safe or sustainable. He turned to face her, devastated. The board could have used that to argue I was operating while impaired, could have stripped my license, opened me up to malpractice suits from every patient I'd operated on during those shifts. But they didn't. Because Dr. Patterson, the woman we just spoke to, buried the report. She buried it, Sarah repeated slowly. Why? Because she'd been doing the same thing for 30 years. Because the entire culture of cardiac surgery operates on the assumption that surgeons are superhuman, that we can function at peak performance indefinitely without rest, and because exposing me would have meant exposing the systemic problem. Myles's voice was hollow, so she buried it, and I walked away with a clean record, a destroyed hand, and the knowledge that I was protected by the same system that created the problem. And Tessa knows about this. I don't know how. The report was sealed, but if she's threatening to expose something... He stopped, his hands flexing at his sides. If that report becomes public, it won't just destroy me. It'll destroy Dr. Patterson, the hospital, every surgeon who's ever worked those kinds of hours. The liability would be catastrophic. Sarah's mind was already moving through the legal implications, the strategic options, the defensive positions they could take. But beneath the professional analysis, she felt something else entirely. A fierce, protective rage at the system that had chewed Myles up and then forced him to hide the evidence of his own suffering. "We're not letting her use this," Sarah said flatly. "Sarah, if that report comes out, it won't. Because I'm going to make sure Tessa understands that if she releases sealed medical board documents, she's not just facing a restraining order, she's facing criminal charges for theft and distribution of confidential medical records, federal charges, probably, given the interstate implications." Sarah pulled out her phone. "I'm calling my investigator. If Tessa has that report, she got it illegally, which means we can go after her for how she obtained it, not just what she's threatening to do with it." "That won't protect Dr. Patterson." "Dr. Patterson protected you when you needed it. Now it's our turn to protect her." Sarah's voice softened. "Myles, you're not responsible for the entire broken system of medical training. You were a victim of it. And if exposing that helps change things, then maybe that's not the worst outcome. You want me to go public with this. I want you to stop carrying this alone." Sarah moved closer. Close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of 3 years of secrets. "You told me earlier that you destroyed your career through arrogance. But that's not what happened. A system that demanded superhuman performance exploited you and then blamed you when you proved to be human. That's not your fault. That's institutional failure. The patients I operated on while impaired had successful outcomes. I checked." Sarah held up her phone, showing him the research she'd done. "Every single surgery you performed in the month before your accident had positive results. No complications, no malpractice claims. You were exhausted, yes, but you were also brilliant enough that even exhausted, you were better than most surgeons at their peak." Myles stared at her like she'd just rewritten his entire understanding of his own history. When did you? "I'm an asset protection attorney. Research is what I do." Sarah set down her phone. "And what I found is that you're not the liability you think you are. You're a surgeon who survived an impossible system and then built something extraordinary from the wreckage. That's the story. Not the exhaustion, not the buried report. The survival and the innovation and the refusal to let one terrible moment define your entire life." "You make it sound heroic." "It is heroic." Sarah's voice was fierce. "You could have walked away from medicine entirely, could have let the accident destroy you. Instead, you invented a device that's going to revolutionize cardiac care. That's not just survival, that's transformation." Myles moved toward her, and when he reached up to cup her face with both hands, the tremor in his right hand present but no longer something he was trying to hide, Sarah felt her breath catch. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly. "That's not your call to make." Sarah's hands came up to cover his. "And for what it's worth, I think you deserve someone who sees you clearly. All of you, including the parts you think are broken, and chooses to stay anyway. Is that what you're doing? Choosing to stay? I don't know yet. Ask me again in 2 days when the contract expires and this stops being a professional arrangement. She managed a shaky smile. But for tonight, yes, I'm staying. And we're going to handle Tessa together, and we're going to protect Dr. Patterson, and we're going to make sure that buried report stays buried until we decide, together, whether it's strategic to bring it to light. Together, Myles echoed, and the words sounded like a promise. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like a practice kiss. This was passionate, desperate, and honest, and tasted like relief, like two people who'd been carrying impossible weights, finally setting them down long enough to reach for each other. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Myles rested his forehead against hers. "This is a terrible idea," he murmured. "Probably the worst. We've known each other less than 48 hours. Terrible timing. And we're in the middle of a crisis that could destroy both our careers. Spectacularly bad judgment." Sarah pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "So what do you want to do about it?" Myles's smile was slow and genuine and made her heart stutter. "I want to see where this goes. After the 4 days, after the crisis, when we're just two people who aren't performing for anyone." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. "I want to make love to you. I want to take you to that taco truck near the hospital. I want to hear about your terrible cooking skills. I want to meet your mother and let her interrogate me about my intentions. I want—" He stopped and his voice dropped. "I want to know what we could be if we weren't pretending. That's a lot of wants for someone who met me 36 hours ago. I'm an efficient decision maker. It's a surgeon thing." Sarah laughed despite everything, and the sound felt like permission. To want this, to risk this, to believe that maybe something real could come from something that started as performance. "Okay," she said, 2 more days of the contract, and then we figure out what comes next." "Deal." They stood in the living room of the presidential suite, still in their formal wear, and Sarah realized this was the moment, the reveal, the crack in both their armor, the choice to be seen and to see in return. And for the first time in 6 months, she wasn't afraid of what that seeing might cost her. She was only afraid of what it might cost if she walked away. Chapter 8. The Break. Sarah woke to her phone buzzing at 6:47 a.m., dragging her out of a restless sleep. She'd spent most of the night replaying the conversation with Myles, the confessions, the kisses, the tentative agreement to see what came after the contract expired. She reached for her phone and felt her stomach drop. "Dennis White, call me, now." Dennis White. "Before you talk to anyone else." Dennis White. "Bruce showed up at the hotel. He's in the lobby causing a scene." Sarah was out of bed, pulling on clothes before her conscious mind fully caught up. She fired off a rapid text, "Give me 5 minutes," and was halfway to the door when she remembered Myles. She knocked softly on his bedroom door. No answer. She knocked again, louder. "Myles?" Nothing. Sarah opened the door. They'd moved past those boundaries last night, hadn't they, and found his room empty. The bed was made with military precision, his tuxedo from last night already hung and covered. A note sat on the nightstand in handwriting she recognized from contract signatures. "Emergency meeting with Dr. Flynn. Licensing terms need immediate revision. Back by 9. Myles." Sarah stared at the note and felt something cold settle in her chest. He'd left, without waking her, without telling her where he was going or when he'd be back, just like Bruce used to do. She crushed that thought immediately. Myles wasn't Bruce. This was different. He'd left a note. But the old wound had already opened, and the fear came flooding through before she could stop it. Her phone rang. Dennis. "Tell me you're not in the lobby," Sarah said by way of greeting. "I'm in the restaurant, having breakfast and watching Bruce pace like a caged animal near the concierge desk. He's been here since 6:30. He knows you're on the executive floor." Dennis's voice was tight. "Sarah, we need to talk about containment before he says something publicly that forces our hand." How did he even find the hotel? Does it matter? He's here, and he's telling anyone who'll listen that you're his fiancée and there's been a terrible misunderstanding and he needs to see you immediately. Dennis paused. He's also saying he has information about your fake marriage arrangement, and he's threatening to go to the bar association if you don't cooperate. Sarah's blood went cold. He doesn't have information. There is no... I know. I know exactly what the arrangement is, and I approved it from a liability standpoint when I first heard of it. Dennis's voice was sharp. Which is why we're going to handle this carefully. Bruce is a desperate man, and desperate men say things that can't be unsaid. We need to get him away from the hotel and contained before he contaminates the entire investor pool. What do you suggest? I'm calling hotel security. I'm having him removed for harassment, and then I'm calling my contact at the Sacramento PD and your investigator to see what we can find on Mr. Gerlach that might discourage him from making any public accusations. Dennis, don't Dennis me. I've been practicing law for 35 years. I know how to handle a man who's trying to extort his ex-girlfriend. You focus on Myles and the EMS licensing deal. I'll focus on Bruce Gerlach. The line went dead. Sarah grabbed her keycard and headed for the elevator, her mind already shifting into crisis management mode. But as the doors descended toward the lobby, she found herself thinking about Myles, about where he'd gone, about why he'd left without waking her, about the tentative vulnerability they'd built last night, suddenly feeling very fragile in the morning light. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby level, and Sarah stepped out into controlled chaos. Bruce was near the concierge desk, arguing with a security guard who looked professionally bored. Dennis was positioned strategically at the restaurant entrance, phone pressed to his ear, watching like a general surveying a battlefield. And standing near the main entrance, speaking urgently with two uniformed police officers, was hotel management. When Bruce saw Sarah, his entire face transformed into something that was supposed to look like wounded devotion and mostly looked like desperation. Sarah, thank God. He moved toward her, but the security guard stepped between them with practiced efficiency. I just need 5 minutes. Please, we can fix this. There's nothing to fix, Sarah said, her voice carrying the flat, affectless tone she used with hostile opposing counsel. You need to leave the hotel immediately, or I will have you arrested for harassment and trespassing. I'm not harassing you. I'm trying to help you. Bruce's eyes were wild now, searching hers for something. Weakness, maybe, or some echo of the woman he'd left. I know what you're doing with Dr. Anderson. I know it's fake, and I'm trying to warn you before this blows up in your face. How do you know anything about my personal life? Because I hired an investigator. I wanted to understand why you were suddenly unreachable, why you wouldn't return my calls, why you seemed to have moved on so completely. Bruce's voice cracked slightly. And I found out you're running some kind of scam with this doctor, and I thought if I came here and told you what I'd discovered, you'd see that you need me, that you can't do this alone. The confession was so transparently selfish that Sarah almost felt sorry for him. I don't need you, she said quietly. I've never needed you. What I did was make myself small enough to fit in the space you'd carved out for yourself, and I'm done doing that for anyone. Sarah? Officers? She turned to address the uniformed police. This man has been calling my office repeatedly, requesting financial assistance under the guise of personal reconciliation. He showed up at my hotel uninvited, and he's making threats and innuendos regarding my professional reputation. I'd like to file a formal harassment complaint. One of the officers stepped forward with a notepad, and Bruce's face went white. You can't. I'm not threatening you. I'm trying to... Help yourself to my professional network and my financial resources, Sarah finished. Yes, I'm aware. That's exactly why you're leaving now. Dennis appeared at Sarah's shoulder, phone still in hand. Officers, I'm Dennis White, Ms. Jacobs's senior law partner. We have documentation of repeated unwanted contact, including voicemail messages where Mr. Gerlach explicitly states he's requesting financial assistance for his failing business. We also have a record of him attempting to access Ms. Jacobs's professional contacts without authorization. One of the officers looked at Bruce with the particular weariness of someone who'd seen this exact dynamic play out 100 times before. "Sir, you're going to need to leave the hotel and cease all contact with Ms. Jacobs, or we're going to arrest you for harassment and file a formal restraining order. Your choice." "This is insane," Bruce said, but he was already backing away. "You're going to regret this, Sarah. When this whole thing with Dr. Anderson falls apart, and it will, don't come crying to me." "I wouldn't dream of it," Sarah said, and watched as the officers escorted him toward the door. Dennis turned to her once Bruce was gone. "You okay?" "No." Sarah's hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "But I will be. Thank you for handling that." "That's my job. Yours is to focus on the EMS deal and make sure nothing else implodes before we can get Calhoun to sign the licensing agreement." Dennis glanced toward the elevators. "Where's Myles?" "Emergency meeting with Dr. Flynn. He left early this morning." "Good. Keep him focused on the business side. I'm going to do some additional research on Bruce. See if there's anything else we can use to discourage him from spreading rumors." Dennis's expression was grim. "And Sarah? We need to talk about how to handle the marriage situation when, not if, but when, someone figures out the license doesn't exist." Sarah felt her chest tighten. "We say it's pending, that we got married in a private ceremony and we're handling the paperwork separately for privacy reasons. It's not unusual for high-net-worth individuals to delay legal filing for discretionary reasons. That works, but we need to make sure our story is airtight before anyone pushes, because if the investors find out you two entered into a contractual fake marriage arrangement, it won't matter that it's legal. It'll look like fraud." "I know." Sarah's voice was hollow. "I know exactly how bad this could get." "Then let's make sure it doesn't get there." Dennis squeezed her shoulder. "Go back upstairs, take a shower, center yourself, and when Myles gets back, you two need to be on the same page about how you're going to handle this." Sarah rode the elevator back to the presidential suite, and the silence of the empty space felt like an accusation. Myles had left without waking her. He'd made an emergency call without consulting her. He'd handled a crisis on his own instead of trusting her to help. And she'd immediately jumped to the conclusion that he was like Bruce, that his leaving meant something about what he felt for her. She pulled out her phone and texted him, "We need to talk about this morning, about what comes next." The response came 3 minutes later. "I know, I'm sorry. Can we talk when I get back? There's something I need to tell you about Dr. Flynn and the licensing terms." Sarah stared at the message and felt something shift in her chest. Not relief exactly, but a small crack in the panic that had been building since she'd found his empty bedroom. She showered and changed into professional clothes, and by the time Myles returned at 8:47 a.m., she'd cataloged all the reasons she was being unfair to him and approximately 0 ways to fix it. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his hair slightly disheveled, his right hand tremoring more noticeably than usual. "Dr. Flynn is demanding a modification to the licensing agreement," Myles said without preamble. "He wants to add a clause that allows Stanford to acquire the EMS intellectual property if the Phase 3 trials don't meet specific benchmarks. It's a hostile term that basically gives them the option to steal the device if it underperforms." "And you said no?" "I said I'd consult with your firm." He stopped, seeming to register her expression for the first time. "What happened? You look like you've been crying." "I haven't been. Bruce showed up in the lobby this morning. Dennis had him removed." Sarah's voice was steady, clinical. "He hired an investigator. He knows the marriage isn't legal." Myles went very still. "How much does he know?" "Everything. That it's fake, that we have a contract, that the whole thing is an arrangement." Sarah watched his face carefully. "Dennis is handling him. He's filed a harassment complaint and he's looking for leverage to keep Bruce from spreading rumors." "And what about you? Are you handling it?" The question was so direct that Sarah felt something crack open in her carefully maintained composure. "No," she admitted. "I'm not handling it. I'm terrified. I'm furious at myself for not anticipating that Bruce would look into my personal life. I'm angry at you for leaving this morning without waking me. And I'm absolutely convinced that this entire situation is about to explode in a way that destroys both our careers and probably my entire firm's reputation. Sarah, let me finish. She held up a hand. I'm also having a moment of clarity where I realize I've spent the last 48 hours making you responsible for my emotional stability. And that's not fair. That's not even legal. That's just me repeating the same pattern I fell into with Bruce, attaching myself to someone else's orbit instead of maintaining my own center. Myles moved toward her. You're not doing that. I am, and I need to stop. Because if we're going to make this work, the real thing, not the contract, I need to be able to handle crises without falling apart. I need to be able to trust you to make decisions independently without interpreting it as rejection. And I need to stop assuming that every time you leave the room, you're going to come back and tell me you've decided this was all a mistake. I'm not going to do that. You might. And if you do, I need to be strong enough to handle it without losing myself. Sarah's voice was very quiet. So I'm going to go back to being the attorney who hired you, and you're going to go back to being the client who hired me, and we're going to figure out how to handle both the Bruce situation and the Tessa situation without letting the personal stuff complicate the professional. Sarah, it's necessary, because right now, every time something goes wrong, I panic and assume it's about us. And every time something goes right, I assume it means you're falling for me in the same way I'm falling for you, and neither of those assumptions is fair to either of us. Myles's expression hardened. So, what are you saying? That we go back to the fake marriage? That last night was a mistake? I'm saying that last night was real, but it was also premature. And I need to step back and make sure I'm not just falling for the fantasy of being needed instead of actually falling for you. She forced herself to meet his eyes. Which means we focus on the business. We handle the crisis with Bruce and Tessa. We see if there's anything left between us when the crisis is over. And if there isn't, then at least we'll know we made the right choice. The silence that followed was terrible. Okay, Myles said finally, and his voice was very controlled. We focus on the business. We handle the crisis. We see what's left. Thank you for understanding. I don't understand. His eyes were dark with hurt, but I respect it, and I'll honor it, because apparently that's what you need right now. He turned and walked toward his bedroom, and Sarah felt something break inside her chest. She'd just done exactly what she'd promised herself she wouldn't do. She'd pushed away the one person who'd actually seen her clearly and made herself smaller to make room for her own fear. And the worst part was knowing she'd done it deliberately. Sarah stood alone in the living room, staring at Myles's closed bedroom door, and felt the weight of her own self-sabotage settle over her like a shroud. Her phone buzzed. Dennis White. Bruce just got arrested in the lobby. Sacramento PD had a warrant and were already looking for him. He's been under investigation for 2 months now, fraud charges related to the construction business. He's been running a Ponzi scheme, and 2 of his investors found out that contrary to Bruce's investor reports, there is a lien on the property, and no construction has actually taken place. All the photos, all the expenses faked. No wonder he was desperate for that loan. For you to co-sign. Dennis White. You're clear. He won't be making any more threats. Sarah stared at the message and felt something shift. Not relief exactly, but a small crack in the panic that had been consuming her since she'd woken up. Another text came through. Dennis White. Meeting in conference room 3B in 1 hour. Calhoun, Flynn, Massey, and Turcotte. They want to talk about the marriage situation before they finalize the licensing deal. Bring Myles. And Sarah? Be honest with them. Complete transparency is your only play here. Sarah knocked on Myles's door. When he opened it, his expression was carefully neutral, the surgeon's mask firmly back in place. Bruce was arrested, she said. Fraud charges. Dennis set up a meeting with the investors in an hour. They want to talk about us. About the marriage? Yes. Sarah took a breath. Dennis says we need to be completely transparent. Tell them the truth about how this started and where it is now." "And where is it now?" Myles's voice was very quiet. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but I think we owe them honesty, and we owe each other the same thing." "Agreed." He moved past her to grab his jacket. "Let's go face the firing squad." Conference room 3B was smaller than Sarah expected, an intimate space with a long mahogany table and windows overlooking the San Francisco skyline. Harrison Calhoun sat at the head of the table, flanked by Dr. Flynn, Dr. Massey, and Dr. Turcotte. All four of them looked like they were preparing to conduct a deposition. "Dr. Anderson, Ms. Jacobs." Calhoun gestured to the empty chairs across from them. "Please sit. We have some questions." Sarah and Myles sat, and Sarah felt his hand find hers under the table. Not for show this time, but for strength. "We understand there's been some confusion about the nature of your relationship," Dr. Flynn began, "and given the significant capital investment we're discussing, we need clarity before we proceed." "Of course," Sarah said, her voice steady. "What would you like to know?" "Are you actually married?" Dr. Massey asked bluntly. "No," Myles said before Sarah could answer. "Not legally, not yet." The silence that followed was heavy. "But you represented yourselves as married," Dr. Turcotte said. "Yes." Sarah pulled out her laptop and opened a file. 3 days ago, Dr. Anderson approached me in the hotel bar and asked me to pose as his wife to deter a woman who'd been stalking him for 3 months. I'm an asset protection attorney. He offered me a retainer to act as both his legal counsel and his cover story. We drafted a contract outlining the terms of the arrangement. She turned the laptop so they could see the document, heavily redacted, but clearly legitimate. "You contracted to fake a marriage," Calhoun said slowly. "We contracted to present as a married couple for the duration of the conference," Sarah corrected, "to protect Dr. Anderson from a credible threat and to allow him to focus on the EMS licensing negotiations without interference. And somewhere along the way, it stopped being fake," Myles added quietly. "Somewhere between the museum and the gala and the moments when we weren't performing for anyone, it became real." Dr. Flynn leaned back in his chair. "That's quite a story." "It's the truth," Sarah said. "And I understand if it affects your decision about the licensing deal, but I want to be clear. The EMS device is extraordinary. Dr. Anderson's work is legitimate, and whatever questions you have about our personal relationship shouldn't overshadow the fact that this device will save lives." "Ms. Jacobs," Calhoun started. The door to the conference room burst open. Tessa Astors stood in the doorway, her red dress disheveled, her hair wild, her right hand holding a small silver handgun. "Nobody move," she said, and her voice was shaking. "Nobody better move." Sarah felt Myles go rigid beside her. Dr. Massey made a small sound of terror. Calhoun's hand moved slowly toward his phone. "Don't!" Tessa snapped, swinging the gun toward him. "Put your hands on the table, all of you, now." They complied, moving with the careful precision of people who understood they were in the presence of someone who'd crossed a line from obsession into violence. "Tessa," Myles said, his voice very calm, very controlled. "Put the gun down. Whatever this is, we can talk about it." "Talk?" Tessa's laugh was high and brittle. "You want to talk now? After you humiliated me in front of everyone? After you let your fake wife threaten to destroy my life?" "She's not fake," Myles said. "Sarah is. She's real. What we have is real. And I'm sorry if that hurts you, but it's the truth." "Liar." Tessa's hand was shaking badly now, the gun wavering between Myles and Sarah. "You're lying. You're all lying. I know about the contract. I know this whole thing is a scam, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it too." "Tessa," Sarah's voice was very quiet, "I know you're in pain. I know you feel like you've been wronged, but this isn't the way to fix it. Put the gun down and let's talk. I can help you." "You can't help me." Tessa's eyes were wild now, unfocused. "You took him from me. You took everything from me, just like she did, just like they all did." "Who?" Sarah asked gently. Who took something from you? My sister, Teresa. She always got everything. The boyfriends, the attention, the life I was supposed to have. Tessa's voice broke. And then she got Myles. And then she threw him away like he was nothing. And I thought if I could just make him see that I understood him, that I could love him better than she ever did. But I don't love you, Myles said, and his voice was gentle but relentless. I'm sorry, Tessa. I know that's painful to hear, but I don't love you. I never did, and I never will. Tessa's face crumpled, and for a moment Sarah thought she was going to lower the gun. Instead, she swung it directly at Sarah. Then I'll take her from you, Tessa said, like you took everything from me. Tessa, don't, Myles started to stand. Sit down! Tessa's finger moved toward the trigger. The door behind her burst open, and 2 hotel security guards rushed in, followed by uniformed police officers. Drop the weapon! One of the officers shouted. Drop it now! Tessa spun toward them, the gun still raised, and for one terrible moment, Sarah thought she was going to fire. Then Myles moved. He was across the table and tackling Tessa before Sarah's conscious mind could process what was happening. The gun went off, a deafening crack that made everyone in the room flinch. But the bullet went wide, embedding itself in the ceiling. Myles wrestled the gun from Tessa's hand with the controlled precision of someone who'd spent years making life or death decisions in seconds. And then the police were there, pulling Tessa away, cuffing her, reading her rights while she sobbed and screamed about how it wasn't fair, how she'd only wanted to be loved. Myles turned back to Sarah, his face white, his right hand trembling violently now. Are you hurt? He asked. No. Are you? No. He moved toward her and his hands came up to frame her face, checking for injuries with a surgeon's thoroughness. You're sure you're okay? I'm okay. Sarah's voice was shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. Myles, she could have shot you. You could have... I wasn't going to let her hurt you. His voice was fierce. I am not going to let anyone hurt you ever again. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, and she let them be. That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do. It was the only thing I could do. He pulled her into his arms, and Sarah buried her face against his chest, feeling his heart hammering against her cheek. Behind them, the investors were being escorted out by police for statements. Dr. Flynn paused at the door. Dr. Anderson, he said quietly. That woman, she was the threat you were protecting yourself from? Yes. And Ms. Jacobs was helping you manage that threat? Yes. Dr. Flynn looked between them, at the way Myles was holding Sarah, like she was the only solid thing in a world that had gone dangerously unstable, at the way Sarah's hands were fisted in his shirt, like she was afraid to let go. I think, Dr. Flynn said slowly, that we have all the clarity we need regarding the nature of your relationship. The licensing deal stands, as originally written. We'll finalize the terms tomorrow. He left, and Sarah and Myles stood alone in the conference room, still holding each other, while police officers moved through the space collecting evidence. Sarah, Myles said quietly, what you said earlier, about needing space, about going back to being attorney and client, I was wrong. Sarah pulled back just enough to look at him. I was scared and I was protecting myself, and I was absolutely wrong. Because what I need isn't space. What I need is you. All of you, the brilliant parts and the broken parts and the parts that are terrified of needing anyone. I need you too. His voice was rough. And I'm done pretending I don't. I'm done handling things alone. I'm done being afraid that needing you makes me weak. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Sarah managed a shaky smile. So, what do we do now? We finish the conference, we finalize the licensing deal, and then... Myles paused, and something shifted in his expression. And then we get married. For real. Not because we're scared or we need protection or because it's strategic. Because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life figuring out what that means. Sarah's breath caught. Myles, I know it's fast, I know it's insane, but Sarah, I've spent 3 years rebuilding my life from wreckage, and in 3 days you've made me believe that what I'm building might actually be worth living in. His hands tightened on her face. So yes, I'm asking, will you marry me? For real this time? Sarah looked at him. This brilliant, wounded, extraordinary man who'd just thrown himself between her and a gun without hesitation, and felt the last of her defenses crumble. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you, for real, for always. Myles kissed her, and it tasted like relief and promise, and the beginning of something neither of them had to perform. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah pulled out her phone. I'm calling Emma. We're getting married. Today. Right now. Before anything else can go wrong. Best plan you've ever had, Myles said, and his smile was bright enough to chase away every shadow. So, they were married 6 hours later at San Francisco City Hall, with Dennis and Emma as witnesses and a judge who'd agreed to expedite the ceremony after hearing about the attempted shooting. Sarah wore the midnight blue gown from the gala. Myles wore his tuxedo, and when the judge pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss was real and witnessed and absolutely, completely theirs. Dennis hugged them both afterward. Congratulations, you're either the bravest people I know or the most reckless. Possibly both. Definitely both, Sarah said, and she was smiling so hard her face hurt. They spent their wedding night in the presidential suite, the same space where they'd started this 3 days ago, and when Myles carried her over the threshold, Sarah laughed at the absurdity and the perfection of it. We're married, she said, still not quite believing it. We're married, Myles agreed. For real this time. For real this time, Sarah echoed, and kissed him like she meant to keep doing it for the rest of her life. Because she did. Prologue. 2 weeks later. The email from Dr. Flynn arrived on a Tuesday morning. The EMS Phase 3 trials have been approved. Stanford is fully committed to the licensing partnership. Congratulations, Dr. Anderson. You've built something extraordinary. Myles showed Sarah the email over breakfast in their new shared apartment, a compromise between her San Francisco condo and his Palo Alto house that neither of them loved, but both of them were willing to inhabit together. We did it, he stated, his satisfaction apparent. You did it, Sarah corrected. I just kept the wolves at bay. You did more than that. Myles reached across the table and laced their fingers together. You made me believe I could do it. That's not nothing. Sarah squeezed his hand and felt the faint tremor she now recognized as part of him. Not a flaw, just a fact. So, what comes next? She asked. Next, we plan an actual wedding. With your mother and my parents and all the people who are going to be furious, we got married without them. They're going to kill us. Probably. Myles smiled. But I think it'll be worth it, don't you? Sarah looked at him, her husband, her partner, the man who'd tackled a gunman to protect her, and felt something settle in her chest that felt suspiciously like happiness. Yes, she said. I think it'll be worth it. And it was. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. We will meet up with Myles and Sarah again.